Our story started at the mansion of an Aldori sword lord. Drawn by the promise of a most dangerous task and a commensurately huge reward, heroes of all stripes gathered here.
What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you our story of Pathfinder Kingmaker. So, couple of qualifiers. One, only really focusing on the main story here, not covering a lot of side content, mostly just trying to convey the main story and all of the story beats that go with it as we traverse the game. Second thing, obviously by the very nature of this video, tons of spoilers, which you think I wouldn't have to mention, but nonetheless, there's a comment on at least every one of these style of videos I do where someone complains about it. Now, when we kick the game off, we start in the Aldori mansion, the mansion of one Jamandi Aldori. We are in a bit of a crowd of gathered heroes that have all been invited here for some reason. Now, as our characters on screen are squabbling back and forth, Jamandi herself comes to address the gathering. Jamandi explains that she wants to establish a barony, or at least several baronies, in the Stolen Lands. Now, if you press her during this conversation, obviously she'll tell you that she's not just doing this out of the kindness of her heart, she's doing it for the benefit of Rostland, which is where she is from, which is the country that she is from. Now, because you find this out fairly quickly, I'm just going to go ahead and explain it. Essentially, Jamandi wants you to establish a barony in the Stolen Lands because Jamandi and the Sword Lords are a prominent house of Rostland, which is a country in Brevoy. Brevoy is actually a kind of like big country made up of two smaller countries, Rostland and Izia. As I mentioned, the Aldori Sword Lords are the biggest house in Rostland. In Izia, there's another giant house known as House Sertova. These two groups don't get along, and ever since the leader who united the two countries died, Coral the Conqueror, or didn't necessarily die, but disappeared rather, these two countries have been at each other's throats. And basically, Jamandi is trying to establish allies for the inevitable future conflict as she sees it. Now, once Jamandi has kind of explained things, she'll ask you to set off in the morning and basically enjoy the festivities and stay the night. As soon as this is over, we will meet a small halfling named Lindsay, who is actually the narrator that we've heard up to this point, as well as writing the story of the game. Now, once we've had this conversation, we can exit the hall and go to spend the night. However, almost immediately, we'll be woken up by none other than Lindsay, and she'll explain that the mansion has been attacked by assassins. Now, this section of the game focuses largely on being a tutorial for mechanics and things like that, but you'll be attacked right after Lindsay rushes out of the room by an assassin. You'll need to kill this guy and move on, and a little ways up the hallway you can meet Lindsay as well as Tartusio. Now this guy, spoiler alert, and again you learn it very quickly, he's not your friend, as the intro might have told you, as he's been incredibly rude the entire time, but he'll join your party as you guys try to save yourselves from these assassins. But also, Tartusio will give you a ring, which is essentially a ring of protection, but it's a specific item. Basically, it just gives you a +1 to your armor class. You can choose to put it on or not. Now, as you continue exploring, you're going to run into Amiri, another character from the gathering from earlier. She is a barbarian, obviously likes the straightforward options. As she rushes several enemies, you can help her in this fight. And just past this, we'll go into a bit of an in-game cinematic where we see a large giant come in, led by the assassins. Now we're going to cross this large hall that happened in and find ourselves passing an armory. Now in order to get the key to the next room, we have to go into the armory where the key is. So as we're searching the armory, Tartusio basically is like, hey man, we should steal all this stuff. You can choose to do so or not. But once you get the key, you can move up to the next hallway. Upon doing so, you'll run into Jathal. She explains very quickly that the reason everyone around her is dead and she isn't is because they hit a bunch of poison traps and she is undead. And basically the type of damage these traps don't do anything to her. She refuses to explain how or why she's undead at the time, but again, she'll join your party and you guys can carry on. This is where you'll run into treasure rooms up a bit from you. So you'll run into some bandits talking about a hidden room in the mansion. You can choose to take some time to find a hidden room with some treasure in it if you so choose. There's actually two separate rooms here, but basically these rooms with the statues you'll find just north of here. If you can get all of the statues to raise their swords and all of them to lower their swords, each one of those options will open a room. You can get some extra loot. Now, once we get out into the proper courtyard area, just past this area, and we kill the assassins there, we'll run into Kayesi, who is a tiefling. She is actually a companion that is included with the Wild Cards, I believe it is, DLC. But regardless, she's a DLC companion, I guess is what I'm trying to tell you. And then we can also talk to Harem. So Harem is a cleric And if you go talk to him, as he seems to have been injured by the assassins, it turns out that he's just fine. He's just being dramatic because he is a cleric of Grotus, which is like the inevitable end kind of thing. The dude's a bit of an emo. But if we go forward here after we've convinced Harem to join us, we can speak with Keston. Keston is like the head guard. He's in the courtyard just next to this fiery door here. Now, he directs you to go help Lady Jamandi, who's, presumably the target of all these assassins, right? And once you are done with this conversation and speaking with Keston, you can move into the fiery room that you have to go through to reach Lady Jamandi. And this is where we are introduced to text events. So every once in a while throughout the game, you'll run into these like text events where it plays out through these story choices, and there's like skill checks associated with them that you can like pass or fail, and ultimately you'll pass or succeed the event. Now in this event, we kind of meet our next companion, or potential companion, Valerie. Valerie is a tower shield fighter, and she is trying to help some guards that are caught in this fire during the text event to safety. You can choose to help her or not. And once that's done, the next room, right after this area, is the exit, where we will then come to a bit of a boss fight of sorts, where we need to help Lady Jamandi fight off the assassins as she fights the giant frost enemy from earlier. Now, she's going to take care of the giant, but all you have to do is kill all the other assassins in the room, which isn't too bad because it's the tutorial, of course. Now, once Jamandi has been saved, we need to speak to her, of course, to carry on. Now, this will initiate a bit of a scripted conversation, and this is where we find out that, obviously, somebody let these assassins in. Somebody opened the gate for them, which means Jamandi has a spy among people gathered here. And our friend, let's say, Tartusio, immediately tries to throw you under the bus, making it pretty clear he's probably the spy. Now, if you have that ring on you, actually like equipped, that he gave you earlier, then he'll try to use that as a means to point you out as the spy. But you can deny it, of course. Now, regardless of whether or not you pass or fail any of these checks, Jamandi basically says that she can't definitively rule out either of you being the spy. So she is going to split all of the people gathered here into 2 teams and send you both off to the Stolen Lands immediately, while she conducts an investigation as to who the spy might actually be. Now, this is interesting, this part right here. So depending on what you chose to do throughout this tutorial, certain companions will choose to join you, and certain companions will choose to join Tartusio. This is also the first conversation where alignment choices come up. Anytime you see an alignment in parentheses means that is the alignment associated with that thing you're saying, and will move your alignment towards that. Anytime we see an alignment choice in brackets, that choice requires that alignment, as opposed to moving your alignment towards it. Now, that ends the tutorial section of the game, and we move on to the world map. Now, the world map is pretty straightforward. You can only really move along the dotted lines that you see, and there is a fog of war where you will need to kind of, move along the dotted lines, of course, to explore and find areas. Now, you can see the map itself at pretty much any time, but there's this small fog of war that will hide locations that you will then have to explore around and find things. Right now, our road only goes one way. You will be accosted about halfway to Oleg's trading post, which is where we are headed first, which is where Jamandi sends us to first. And once that encounter resolves itself, the game tries to give you the tutorial on the rest mechanic, which I'll spare you guys from. But once that's dealt with, and whether or not you chose to rest, we can make our way to Oleg's trading post. Now, immediately upon arriving at Oleg's trading post, we see someone running out of the trading post, and upon entering, we see bandits accosting none other than Oleg, that the post is named after, getting accosted by these bandits who claim to be collecting taxes for the Stag Lord. Now, we learned at Jamandi's mansion that the Stag Lord is our target. She's sending us to the Stolen Lands to kill this guy. And thus, once we take him out of power, we can stake our claim on his land, thus establishing our barony. Now, we can fight these bandits right here. There's a woman named Kressel who will leave this fight if it happens right here, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. So once we take out these bandits, Svetlana will come out, who is actually Oleg's wife, and you can talk to them both, and they will explain that these bandits will likely be back in greater numbers to basically assault the trading post after this just happened. Now, we can take this moment to poke around the trading post and actually prepare for this fight. So we can splatter oil near the front door if we find it. We can convince the guy who ran out of the trading post when we first arrived to help us fight, as well as set up traps in the oil and stuff that we lay down to help catch the bandits. And when we are ready, We can speak to Oleg to initiate this fight by waiting, essentially. Oleg will ask us if we would like him to use his alchemist's fire to set the, bandits on fire, basically, as they come running through the gate. You can agree to that or not, doesn't really matter. So, once these bandits show up after you've talked to Oleg and waited, all of the preparations that you've made or didn't make will go off, and then you'll be forced to fight these bandits. Now, once this is done, Oleg will invite you to rest upstairs, as this is basically an inn. So, you'll need to do just that. You'll need to go upstairs and rest. So, once you rest in the bed, after a couple hours, you'll be woken by none other than some sort of nymph, like a spirit of the forest, who tells you to call herself the Guardian of the Bloom. Now, she'll beg you to help take out the Stag Lord, which, you're already going to do that anyway, to establish your barony, and she will point you towards the Thorn Ford, saying that she used her powers to find out that some of the Stag Lord's bandits are camped there. She also explains that the Stag Lord seems to be responsible for a fog that is surrounding the area. Now, this is important to note because all this fog actually is essentially a barrier to the rest of the map to keep you in the appropriate area for the chapter. You'll find stuff like this throughout the game. Basically, areas they don't want you going to yet, you can't because there will be some sort of barrier like this. Sometimes it's guards on the road type stuff. In this particular chapter, it happens to be fog. But after this, we complete our rest, and now that we have a location to track down, we can do so. So Oleg's trading post for the rest of this chapter will act as a bit of a base. It is where we can rest safely without worrying about being attacked. You can speak to your assembled companions, as well as buy and trade things from Oleg and Boken. Boken is the guy who ran out of the fort earlier and may or may not have helped you. He's an alchemist. Now, as we leave Oleg's trading post, guaranteed we will run into a man named Remus. Remus seems to be out of sorts. Basically, he's meant to be like a crazy traveler guy, and he'll say a bunch of crazy things to you. And then out of nowhere, he'll point you to Tartusio's trail, which is more or less on the way to Thorn Ford, which is where we were headed to meet the Stag Lord's bandits. Or at least find them, I should say. Now, this is interesting, because if you head to the tomb that Remus points you towards first, you'll actually meet Tartusio there. Now that's important because if you meet him there, he's having the companions he took with him and some mercenaries look for signs of some artifact there. But more importantly, what you can do here is use the diplomacy skill to convince one of the companions he took with him to join your team, which is a great opportunity to help fill out your team because you'll only have 4 members as opposed to the max of 6. Now, if Tartusio is there and then he leaves as soon as the combat starts because, he sicks his mercenaries on you and then walks away basically. But once this fight is over and we go to the exit, a text event will start to track down Tartusio. You can fail this text event. It's very possible to do so, but it's not a big deal if you do. If you do pass it, you'll find yourself in a clearing where Tartusio has taken on the guise of a kobold and is directing kobolds to help him search for this artifact that he mentioned earlier. Now again, he'll run away here, but you'll know that kind of where he is around the area of the old sycamore. Now if you failed it, you won't get this part. Either way, we'll get back to that a little later. For now, we're headed to the Thorn Ford. So we're going to find the Stag Lord's bandits there. You can kill them. The woman Cressel from earlier will be there. And if you are a good aligned character, you can choose to spare her, which helps with the ending slides for Oleg's trading post. But honestly, it doesn't really matter if you kill her. In the bandits' camp, we will find a prisoner there. We can release him. His name is Jod Kavkin. He is a cleric of Erastil, the elk god, who was sent by none other than Erastil himself, because he got visions, to find the elk temple, as it has apparently been desecrated in some way. He'll ask you to find it, and says if you find it, please tell him. And he'll go back to Oleg's trading post at this point. Now, from here, if we search the bandit camp, we'll find 2 things of note. One are written orders to Cressel to go burn down this old hut. We heard mention of this old hut from the nymph, who mentioned that it's important to the Stag Lord for some reason, but she didn't know where it was. Once we get these written orders, the old hut's location will be revealed on our map and we can go there. The other important thing we can find here, if you have the appropriate skills to do so that is a secret cache of wine in the bandit camp. Apparently, it was supposed to get sent back to the Stag Lord. You can choose to poison this wine in the hopes that, it gets sent back to the Stag Lord's fort, wherever that is, and it gets them all poisoned. However, I will point out that you just killed all these bandits, so how this wine is getting back there makes zero sense, but nonetheless, you can do it. And then from here, we can leave Thornford and head out to the old hut that is now revealed on our map. Now, upon arriving, we'll meet with the nymph from earlier, who will show us visions, so to speak, of the past as we explore the area. It turns out that this old hut is the Stag Lord's old house, where we can learn through these visions that he was actually abused by his father, who was a very terrible person. Basically, it looks like his mom died and his dad just kind of lost it and, was an awful human being to his son, who later turned into the Stag Lord. Somehow he managed to gain the confidence and overcome his dad and took him prisoner. His dad is a druid. Now, once we learn these things through these visions, we can find a shrine of sorts to the elk god, Erastil. At this point, the nymph will point out that it's probably a temple of the elk thing, which we had just heard about from Jod as well. So once we do this, the temple of the elk will be revealed on our map. And the nymph will explain that whatever is causing this fog that she needs removed to help, reveal where the Stag Lord is likely being caused by whatever is happening at the temple of the elk, which would make sense because Jod also told us that it seemed to have been being desecrated, which is why he was receiving visions from his god. Now, from here, we're going to head down to the temple of the elk. The nymph, once you arrive at the temple, will warn you of beasts, which are kind of all around the outer edge of the map. But the most important thing here is that there is a large bear attacking a man at the steps of the temple. Once we kill that bear and talk to the man who's being attacked, it turns out to be a guy named Tristan, who is a priest of sorts, who was there trying to cleanse the corruption himself, it would seem. Now, he'll explain that he thinks the fog is being caused by these beasts that have gathered around it after whatever ritual was performed that caused this fog. So to clear it out, basically you need to kill all of these corrupted beasts. Now, if you've already killed all of them, then it's done. However, if you talk to Tristan and they're not all dead, you'll have to go kill them and then talk to him again. And then Tristan will explain that this should clear the fog out, but, it'll be a waiting game. Now, what this actually is a bit of a hurry up and wait type barrier. So essentially, what you need to do now is resolve the quest around Tartusio, which will effectively then clear the fog out. Basically, you have to do this as well as resolve Tartusio's quest, and then the fog will be cleared out at that point. Now, Tristan will offer to join our party as well, which can nab us another follower. This is a good time to mention that at some point as we're traveling through the area of the world map, we will be stopped at a random encounter that is unevadable, and it turns out to be a mage named Kalana of the Technic League. The Technic League are slavers. Essentially, they try to take you and your companions as slaves. Obviously, you can fight with them, or, knowing that you can't beat them, so, if you feel like you can't, you can offer up one of your party as a slave and then track them down. Now, once this event is solved, it'll start another text event as soon as you leave the event area. And you can use this to track down the Technic League encampment. Again, it's possible to fail this, at which point you'll just have to go find the encampment. Now, once there, we can kill all of the slavers in the area, and upon doing so, we can meet Octavia and Reganagar. I think I'm pronouncing his name right, I have no idea. These are also two available companions for us, and once we kill the slavers and free Octavia and Reganagar, we can offer them to join our party, and we can choose what to do with Kalana, either kill her, spare her, let the Octavia or Reganagar kill them, whatever, and we can then, have them as party members should we so choose. Now, this brings us back to the old Sycamore. So, if you failed the text event to follow Tartusio from the ancient tomb, and you go to the old Sycamore first, because you will have to do that, then I'll explain what happens. Either way, once you get to the old Sycamore, you're going to meet Keston from Jamondi's mansion again. Keston will explain that they concluded the investigation, they proved that Tartusio was in fact the spy who let the assassins in at Jamondi's mansion. Keston will then, if you failed the text event from earlier, mark the location that completing that text event would have marked on your map. And, you would have arrived at immediately. If you failed that text event, you have to go talk to Keston, go back to, I believe, Pine Patch is the name of the place, have the scene with Tartusio, where he is disguised as a kobold, and then runs off to the old Sycamore. At which point you have to come back to the old Sycamore, and then go about events there. Because if you arrive at the old Sycamore without having done the Pine Patch part, you can't get into the dungeon we need to get into to carry on with the story. So essentially, it will give you a different map of the old Sycamore that doesn't let us do what we need to do. But either way, Keston will ask us to apprehend Tartusio and sets us about our business. So once we have that scene with Tartusio being a kobold, we can go to the old sycamore to, find him as he continues to search for this relic he keeps mentioning that now he's trying to wrap these kobolds up in. Now, once we are at the old sycamore and we have that part out of the way and we move up the path, we will run into some mites and some kobolds in a disagreement, shall we say, about their respective relics. And if you talk to them, you'll find out that essentially what's happening here is that a civilization of mites and a civilization of kobolds both live under this sycamore tree. They both have a sacred relic. Tartusio came, the purple kobold, as they call him, and stole the kobold's relic in order to get into the inner sanctum under the old sycamore, where he could then find this relic, which is apparently where it is. The kobolds, thinking the mites stole this relic from them, decided to steal their relic, the mites' relic. Essentially, our long-term goal here is to get the mites' relic so we can open the inner sanctum, so we can confront Tartusio, because that's where he is. We can learn that from talking to these two chieftains of each kobold and mites, respectively. If we are neutral, we can actually persuade both of them to let us investigate while they fight each other. Otherwise, you can pick a side. You can either pick a side with the mites or pick a side with the kobolds, or you can choose to just kill all of them. Now, the best ending for this area in slides at the end of the game is to pick the neutral option. Now, that is a required neutral choice, so if you're not playing a neutral character, you'll have to either pick a side or kill all of them. Now, I chose to side with the kobolds in this particular instance because I'm choosing to roleplay a lawful evil character for this playthrough. And moreover, siding with the kobolds make it easier to go to the dungeon underneath the old sycamore map, where we can then go talk to the kobold leader, Chief Suitscale, who will then just give us the mites relic that we need. Now, from here, we actually have to go to the opposite side of this dungeon, which is where the mites lair is, which is where the Queen of the Mites retreats to, if we choose to side with the kobolds, or, regardless of how it plays out, that's where she retreats to. And it is from her little throne room area that we can get into the inner sanctum. Now, this dungeon is actually separated in half, and there is a second dungeon, which is like basement level 2, shall we say, where you can traverse to either side of the separated first level. Now, once you fix the passage, which requires you to be on both sides of it at some point, you can then traverse that first level without too much of a hassle. But regardless, once we have the mites relic, we need to go to the mites queen's throne room, where we can find Tartusio in the inner sanctum, which we need the mites relic to open. Now, obviously, with us taking sides or not, if we're neutral, we can either choose to kill the queen of the mites or Chief Suitscale of the kobolds, depending on, who we chose. That will become a small side quest if you chose to side with one of the factions. If we are neutral, neither of them will be hostile, which makes this entire encounter so much easier. But regardless, once we have that relic, we've dealt with that situation, and we can get to the mites throne room. We can activate the door with the mites relic to get into the inner sanctum, where we can confront Tartusio. As we walk in, we see Tartusio using a portal to send whatever relic he gathered from under this tree to his master. Now, if we press him about it during a quick conversation, he refuses to tell us what it is because he's not that dumb, as he likes to put it, and you will have to fight him. There is no way to talk your way around this. So once Tartusio is dead, we can collect some things off his body, but that pretty much resolves it. And then we have to go back to Keston at Oleg's trading post and explain what happened, that basically we weren't able to apprehend him. However, as we go to leave the area, we get a short cutscene where a mysterious figure makes some weird comments and resurrects Tartusio. Now, we can't do anything with this at the time. We can't go back and see what happened. Essentially, we just know that he was resurrected, and we can leave the area. So we head back to Oleg's trading post, and once we do so, the nymph will actually confront us at the gates and explain that the fog is cleared, and she will reveal the location of the Stag Lord's fort to us now, which now that this is done, we can go take care of. But while we're at Oleg's trading post, we can go talk to Keston, who is inside the inn, tell him that while we weren't able to apprehend Tartusio, he is dead now. Keston says, great, you complete that quest, and now we can head out to the Stag Lord's fortress to kill him and finally establish our barony. Now, we can go straight to the Stag Lord's fort. Nothing really stopping us at this point. Once we get there, things get fun. This can actually go a lot of ways. A lot goes into this Stag Lord's fort area. It's really cool. So, We can sneak our way in, or we can go right up to the gate. So if we go to the far left, we can hop over the gate, or we can go right up to the front gate. We can try to bluff our way in, saying that we are the new recruits. It's worth noting, if we go try to bluff our way in and we fail, and then we go try to sneak over, we'll instantly alert the guards. So if you're going to try to sneak in, you need to do it first, because if you fail the bluff check, it just is what it is. If you go up to the gates, you can actually choose to just challenge the Stag Lord in honorable combat, which is like the worst thing you can do, because it'll skip to a fight, but you'll have to fight the entire camp all at once. It's incredibly difficult. Would not recommend it. So either bluffing or sneaking our way into the camp, or, just trying to go through the front gate and then, having to jump over the wall or whatever, and then fighting all the guards. As we fight groups of guards inside the Stag Lord's fort, once they are down to one enemy in a group, so there's usually like groups of 3 or 4 here and there. Once only one of them is alive, they'll make a run for the alarm bell. If he reaches the alarm bell, he will set off the alarm, and the Stag Lord will be, notified, and that fight sequence will commence. It's important that that doesn't happen if you want to do like all the little side things you can do in the fort. So you might want to save a lot in this area, because save scumming might be your best friend right here. So some of the things we can do here are convince one of his lieutenants to actually help us fight him. We can kill 2 of his other lieutenants, or let them go if we so choose, or let one of them go rather and kill the other one. If we choose to let him go, he does pop back up later. So honestly, I just recommend killing him right here, the one that tries to offer you a deal for the sake of his life. And then lastly, you've probably noticed an owlbear in a cage at the center of this fort. We can go up to the gate. If we pass a lore nature check, we can convince the owlbear to actually help us and not see us as a foe. We can lock the gate better so it doesn't escape, or we can pass a strength check to just kill the thing without, entering the cage. Now, as a bit of a spoiler, basically once the fight with the Stag Lord starts, this owlbear is going to break out of its cage if we don't do anything. So we can either befriend it, so when it breaks out of the cage it helps us. We can lock the cage better so it doesn't get out at all, or we can just kill it outright. But all 3 require us to pass a check. Now, once all of that's done, and we've killed all the roving bands of bandits in the camp, ideally, we can approach the Stag Lord's fort, at which point the Stag Lord will, come out and start the fight. Now, the difficulty of this depends on what you did of all of the things that I just mentioned. Also, if you poisoned the wine earlier at Thorn Ford, the Stag Lord will get a debuff as well. Again, I want to point out that you killed every bandit in that camp, so how they got the wine back to the fort or why they would trust that wine is beyond me, but whatever. At this point, you'll have to kill the Stag Lord after, all of the consequences of the decisions you've made up to this point play out. If you can get the owlbear to help you out, that is actually really cool. That was a fun time. But regardless, once you've killed the Stag Lord, I recommend you loot his body. He's got a lot of good loot, especially at this level, so take all of his gear. And then you can explore inside of his little fort, shall we say, which is really just like a cabin, to be honest. But you can actually find his dad in there, locked up in a cell. If you open it, he becomes immediately hostile and tries to kill you. So you can kill his dad if you want to. But once we've looted and done everything we want to do here, we need to head back to Oleg's trading post and tell Oleg the good news, that the Stag Lord is dead. At this point, Oleg will recommend we head back to Restov and explain to Jamandi that, we've killed the Stag Lord and we're ready to claim our barony. However, you can choose to be like, hold on, I've got some unfinished business. Now, as soon as you tell Oleg you're ready to go tell Jamandi things, you'll skip back to Jamandi's mansion, and chapter 1 will end. So that is going to wrap up part 1 of our Pathfinder Kingmaker story series. I hope you enjoyed it. It's a very strong intro to the game. I actually enjoy it quite a bit. But regardless, thank you so much for watching. More parts will hopefully be up soon until we have the entire story of the game up, at which point I will make a supercut. But again, thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you part 2 of our story series for Pathfinder Kingmaker. Just as a reminder, we are only really focused on the main story. We're not covering a ton of side content unless it specifically relates to the main story in some way. And I'm not really going over the companions too much, again, except for the moments where the companions are tied to the main story. Last we left off, we had just liberated a portion of the stolen lands from the Stag Lord, and we needed to report back to Jamandi about our success. So we can speak to Oleg whenever we are ready to do that, and then it will teleport us back to Jamandi's mansion where we started the game at. We find ourselves in a small room where we can speak to Jamandi, and she will explain more of the political situation that I've already explained to you in part 1 of this series, so we won't go over it again. And she'll tell you that when she's giving you this barony, she's going to assign you an envoy, which is her adopted son, Kasil Aldori. Then we find ourselves in a banquet hall enjoying the feast and celebration. What we need to do here is speak to guests. This is actually pretty interesting because we can meet some people of note. There is Lander Lebeda, I think his name is, as well as a woman from House Sertova, which is the Aldori Sword Lord's rivals. Natalia is the head, Sertova person. And then she suggests maybe instead of taking Kasil as an envoy with you, perhaps you should take on her envoy, Chandra, instead. And she subtly implies that, your nation might not last so long under amicable terms with the Sword Lords. Again, just exploring more of that political strife I've already explained. Lander is another envoy you could potentially take if you so choose. You can also speak to Magar Varn, who actually conquered Varnhold, which you can relive through the DLC Varnhold's Lot. Varnhold is the area directly next to the area you took in the Stolen Lands, and we will actually talk more about that in a later episode. We can also talk to one Hannes Draliv, who is the third person that was actually sent to the Stolen Lands, who's supposed to be taking over the area of Glenabon. We can also find Kayesi again, which is the tiefling from the prologue of the game, who decided not to follow ourselves or Tartusio into the Stolen Lands, but rather stick around Restov. She will approach us explaining that she has found word of a treasure that resides in the lands you are about to take over. So once the ceremony's over, she asks you to meet her in your capital, or what will be your capital, and talk to her about it, which is how you can take her on as a companion, provided you have the appropriate DLC to do so. Now, when you're ready and you've spoken to all these people, we can go talk to Jamandi at the front of the feast hall and begin the ceremony. Now, this is where we earn the title of Baron and are formally granted our barony to start dealing with. Now, it is right at this moment, right before this actually, you can talk to Jamandi and basically demand a different envoy. You can take her adopted son, which is the default option. You can take Lander Lebeda, or you can take Chandra. Now, truthfully, the first option is actually the best option. The adopted son of Jamandi is actually probably the best person to take. Slight spoiler warning for future episodes, but if you take the other two, they wind up leaving you high and dry later in the game. One of them will come back to help you later, but honestly I don't recommend it. You're probably just better off taking Kasil, or Castle, however you pronounce that guy's name. Now, after this, the game jumps forward about 6 months or so, and you arrive in your new capital. You will be greeted by Keston, the head of the guard for Jamandi, who has now been assigned to help you in addition to Kasil, and he will give you a tour of the capital, kind of explaining what things are, where things are. He'll also explain that this capital has actually been established in place of the Stag Lord's old fort, so where that fort was is our new capital. He can also explain that all of the companions we've picked up to this point are in town somewhere. And then right after our tour, we get an explanation on kingdom management. Now, for the sake of this playthrough, we are going to have it set on automatic, simply because it's not really related to the main story that much. But typically speaking, during the game, you would actually have to manage your own kingdom. I give a bit more information on that in my review after 100% of this game if you're interested. But suffice to say, we're not really going to talk about kingdom management outside of how it relates to the main story. Now, after this, we will be greeted by Jod and Tristan. They will explain to us that following the desecration of the Temple of the Elk, there seems to be a spot nearby the capital where a similar magic feels like it's at play. Basically, the area around there seems to be cursed. So, we're going to talk about this curse for a second, simply because this is important. So, the Ancient Curse is a 7-part quest. I'm explaining it this way because what the actual Ancient Curse is a time gate. So essentially, during each chapter of the game, prior to the last few chapters, which happen one right after the other, during most of the chapters of the game, you'll get an Ancient Curse phase, where basically you're given an allotted amount of time, usually 6 months to a year of in-game days, where the curse will be building in power. And then at the end of that time, the curse will come to fruition. You'll have to head to a certain area to fend off the initial attack wave, as well as do a kingdom management event to curb the curse, and then it begins the next phase after that. Now, each phase, typically speaking, outside of 1 or 2 exceptions, falls in line with the chapters of the game. Essentially, The in-game chapters are timed by this curse. You have so much time to complete them, or your game fails because you didn't address the problem and it grew in so much power, it essentially took over your barony, is kind of the thinking there. So basically, just know that the Ancient Curse is a timer on the game. Now, after this, we can exit the throne room, where we will be met by the nymph who was guiding us through Chapter 1, and she will ask us to meet her alone at a location called Verdant Chambers. There is a lot of foreshadowing that, like, maybe this isn't a good idea. The journal's like, I don't know that this is a good idea, like even stuff like that, because the journal is written as our companion Lindsay's voice or whatever. So there's a lot of foreshadowing. Now, surprise, surprise, when you go there alone, because it won't trigger otherwise, but once you go there alone, the Guardian of the Bloom, the nymph that's been helping us, actually betrays and ambushes us. We don't get much explanation for this at the time, simply that clearly she needed our help getting rid of the Stag Lord and then tried to kill us immediately afterwards. Now, as an encounter, I actually kind of hate this. So you're alone, she'll summon a bunch of very high-level monsters to confront you, in an effort to kill you, obviously, and you're by yourself. This is an encounter where you're basically just trying to escape. You're not trying to fight or kill these monsters because realistically, while it is technically possible, it would be incredibly difficult and require a lot of save scum and lucky dice rolls. Now, the annoying part about this is that escaping this encounter is actually heavily favored towards martial characters, basically anyone with a high athletics or a high mobility skill. Because when you click on this tree in the middle of the area, she's going to start the ambush. And ideally what you want to do is pass the athletics check behind you, scale the wall, follow the wall down to a mobility check, which will then lead you to an exit map, and you'll only have to fight like maybe one monster. The problem with this is, if your character is not spec'd for the incredibly high athletics check climbing the wall behind you requires at the time, it is a 22 requirement athletics check, which means you need a 22 dice roll to actually pass it. So, your 1 through 20 dice roll and then modifiers to bring you up to 22, which at this point in the game is a fairly decently high skill check. And again, most martial characters should be able to pass this at the time. The problem is if you're paying like a caster or a ranged character who's probably not going to have that athletics check, that's going to be a real pain, because at that point, if you absolutely cannot pass this athletics check, what you have to do is use a potion of invisibility to sneak past all of the monsters and around the wall of the castle or whatever kind of structure it is here to get to that second mobility check. This encounter sucks. It's not impossible, it's just unnecessarily difficult, and I don't find it very balanced for characters, especially when they specifically send you there alone. I mean, I get that she's trying to kill you, but also it feels just unfair on any difficulty you are on. Now, around this time, we will have been given a 30-day countdown to the initial start of the Ancient Curse that I mentioned earlier. We have a couple weeks to start getting our bearings before things start happening with the actual next chapter that we find ourselves in. So after a couple of weeks, we will get reports of trolls causing trouble in our barony, and the chapter, Troll Trouble, will start. Now, you can actually go to the areas associated with Troll Trouble beforehand, but nothing will be started yet until you get that initial report in your throne room about trolls starting to attack your barony. Now, this usually happens with about a couple of weeks to go until the initial Ancient Curse, which again is a 30-day timer. So just keep in mind at some point you'll have to swing back around, do the Ancient Curse part, which will then give you like a 6-month timer to complete Troll Trouble in. Now, the first part of Troll Trouble, and keep in mind from here, all of these might not necessarily be in order because of the way the game plays and flows. I'm going to try to present it in a manner that makes the most sense, but keep in mind some of this stuff might not be in order specifically as it would happen. Now, very near to our capital, a ford at Skunk River, I believe the location is called, we can meet Jubilost and Tartuk. Remember, Tartuk is actually Tartusio's disguise from Act 1. But essentially, at this ford in the river, we can find a bunch of gnomes being assaulted by kobolds. And after the initial wave is fended off, Tartuk appears and attacks you guys again after he buffs some more kobolds to send at you. You can point out that he's supposed to be Tartusio. He gets angry and just, buffs the kobolds and sends them at you and then nopes out and leaves. Now, at this point, we can speak to the gnome known as Jubilost, who can be our companion after this. So what we need to do here, we can either have him join us right now, or we are forced to wait until later, because his cart is slowly getting, swept down river. So you need to save his cart. If you fail the text event associated with that, he will not join you until you discover the lair of the trolls. However, if you succeed in the text event, he'll join your party immediately. Truthfully, it doesn't really matter. He is my least favorite companion, but he has a quest where you need to take him to where the troll lair is. So if you get him to join you immediately, it just kind of helps that be a little less annoying. I should probably mention that once we get that initial report of trolls, our real goal for Troll Trouble is to investigate what is going on with these trolls, where they are coming from, and how we can get them to stop attacking our barony. Now, the ultimate actual goal of this is to simply find their lair and take out their leader. But we have to find all of the relevant information first. Now, at some point, we will get a random encounter with a man named Dalton. After we save Dalton's life from trolls, he will explain that for whatever reason, some of these trolls don't seem to be afraid of fire at all. Because normally what kills a troll is fire and acid in Pathfinder. You actually do have to use a fire or acid spell to officially put a troll down. They will not be completely dead until you do so. You can knock them to the ground, but they will eventually get back up unless you actually use fire or acid to kill them. Now, Dalton will explain that this is very odd, of course, and that you should go check on a mage who lives nearby who studies trolls. This will give us access to the lone house, where we can go and find a bunch of bandits in the woods. We can kill them, where we can eventually find our way to a house where we can meet Bartholomew Delgado. Bartholomew is a mage, and he is out here studying trolls, because he is trying to use their regenerative properties and, use them on humans so they would maybe have the same properties. Now, we quickly learn, if we're following this, that he's an unsavory guy. He's doing this by absolutely mutilating a troll named Dimwit. However, from Delgado, we can also learn that the reason some of these trolls are resistant to fire is because they are having a fire resist spell branded onto their skin. Now, we can either tell Bartholomew to cut out the experiments here, or we can let him continue. If you force him to stop the experiments, he'll no longer talk to you, and you lose him as a potential advisor, which I'll get into a little bit later. Now, the next place we can explore is the ruined watchtower. This is where we can find another potential companion, Ikundayo. So Ikundayo was a carpenter in a village before his family and the entire village besides him was killed by trolls. So he's been tracking them and, slowly hunting them all down. He has a bunch of leads as to where you can find trolls in the area. And more importantly, he has a quest where he wants to kill a very specific troll, a rock troll to be specific, named Kargad. Or Kargad. Now, unlike the trolls you've been facing up to this point, Kargad is a rock troll, which means he is not able to be out in sunlight without, petrifying. Now, once we've recruited Ikundayo, and we have his leads that he can give us, we can track those leads down. 2 of them, we can learn a bit more about the trolls, and one of them is actually the location of the troll lair, which normally you wouldn't know, but we're getting to that. The 2 that are not the troll lair, we can learn that the kobolds are being treated as equals to trolls, that kobolds and trolls seem to be helping each other. And moreover, we can find a group of kobolds looking to go find Tartuk, which we know as Tartusio. And we can point them in the right direction, we can kill them outright, we can kind of do whatever, but we learned some things from this conversation, then we can go on our way. The other thing we can learn is simply the name of the leader of the trolls, Hergulka. Hergulka is the person all of these trolls are rallying around, which truthfully by itself isn't that useful information because we'll have learned that regardless. But at this point, the only thing left to do really is actually go to the Dwarven Ruins, which is the subject of harem side quest you'll have been given up to this point already. It is also where Jubilost would like to go, and it is also where Kargad is that we can kill for Ikundayo. However, before you go to the troll place, I would actually recommend waiting a little while, because after we visit the mage at the lone house for the first time, if we wait a little while, we can get a follow-up quest in our throne room, where essentially the troll attacks have increased in pace, and specifically they seem to be trying to get to the lone house and attack Bartholomew for whatever reason. So you are sent there to check up on the mage a second time. Now this time when we go there, we find all of his house and things under attack by trolls trying to kill the guy. So if we get to him, we ideally need to save him from the trolls. However, I will mention that on any of the higher difficulties, that is pretty difficult to do. if his health drops all the way down, you can't save him. He won't die immediately. You will get to talk to him after the fight. But if his health hits 0 here, then it's done. Ideally, you want to save him, but we'll get to that. So kill the trolls, including Dimwit, who have turned on Bartholomew and have attacked him. Now, once you talk to him, if he is alive or if he's dying, he will give you the same quest called a guiding beacon, which will then reveal the location of the troll lair if you haven't already found it yet. But again, if you talk to Ikundayo, one of his leads is the troll lair. So ideally, you would have already found this out. A guiding beacon can also give you the location. In addition to this, in addition to asking us to go find an item that was stolen by the trolls and taken to this lair, which is how he's able to tell you the location of the lair to begin with, if you do that quest successfully and then report back to Bartholomew, he can potentially be one of your advisors if you recruit him to your court. That is important because those instances throughout the game are very rare. Most of your advisors are your companions. So having advisors that aren't your companions there's only like maybe a handful of them throughout the game, let alone ones you can actually recruit. So if you can stomach the fact that this guy is clearly a bit of a sycophant who is experimenting and mutilating trolls, by all means, recruit him to your circle. Now, it's worth mentioning real quick before we get to the last part of this video that while he might be doing unsavory things to trolls, you need to understand that in Pathfinder, trolls eat humans. That is what they do. We are like their number one food source. If they can eat anything, ideally it's us. So keep in mind, all that mutilation isn't wholly unfounded. But, it's still not a great thing to be doing. Now, when we're ready, we can set off to the Dwarven Ruins. Now, once we get there, we quickly discover that this is in fact the lair of the trolls. The trolls themselves are calling this Trobold, which we can learn from the first troll we meet along the path, named Jazan. Now, we can get quite a bit from Jazan, so we can attack him outright if we want, yes, but if we take the time to talk to him, we find out that Tartuk has actually been teaching these trolls Common, which is why Jazan is actually so fluent in it and can talk to us basically as well as a normal human or, sentient being would talk to us. Now, more importantly, Jazan is about as civil as a troll gets. So, if you are playing a lawful character, you can use a required lawful choice to get brought to the inside of the keep and skip the outside portion of this area, which essentially lets you skip a whole map and will save you a lot of time if you have the lawful alignment required to use it. In addition, we are going to meet Jazan later in this dungeon, and if we used this lawful alignment choice, we can actually spare his life and he'll just leave. But either way, once we get inside the keep, we will meet Hergolka at the entrance. He will explain that the reason the trolls have grown so bold and everything lately is that Tartuk met Hergolka and was the first to brand him with this fire resist spell, making them stronger, and then Tartuk took the time to basically teach them. So these trolls have become a real threat to, regular villages and stuff. That said, Hergolka will run away from this initial meeting to retreat into his lair to prepare to fight you, which is where we have to start making our way through the dungeon. Now, if we go left of the initial entrance is where we can find Kargad, where we can resolve Ikundayo's quest one way or the other. Ideally, you want to have him with you, but even if you don't, killing Kargad does resolve that part of the quest. Now, after this, we just have to make our way through the dungeon and find Hergolka and Tartuk's lair. Now, there is a lot of good treasure around the Dwarven Ruins. Not really the focus of this video, but that dungeon is definitely worth actually exploring and finding everything, because you get a lot of very good loot from this place. Now, once we make our way to the very end of the dungeon, we find Hergolka, Tartuk, and a Dwarven anvil that is obviously magical in nature. So it becomes quickly apparent that Tartuk found this Dwarven anvil and was using its magic to brand the trolls, which is where they were getting their fire resistance from. And coincidentally, it is this anvil right here that is the subject of Harem's quest and why he wanted to go to the Dwarven Ruins to begin with, so that's just a side note. And speaking of Jubilost's quest, you literally just have to bring him to the outside portion of the Dwarven Ruins, and then that's it. That quest resolves itself. It seemed a little pointless to me, but nonetheless, that is how you finish that one. Now, when you meet Hergolka and Tartuk, this can go a lot of ways. Now, you're going to wind up fighting Hergolka here, pretty much guaranteed, but again, this can go a lot of ways, so let me explain. You can use a required evil choice to have Hergolka kill Tartuk, and basically explain that, Tartuk was using him, which actually isn't true, but you can use that evil alignment choice to have Hergulka kill Tartuk, and then you just have to fight Hergulka. But assuming you don't use that choice, you're going to need to fight Tartuk and Hergulka. Depending on which one you kill first, it matters if you actually killed both of them. And if you just kill Hergulka, then, he's the kind of the default choice. But the one you kill first matters, because the one you kill first will actually die in this fight. And then once you get the other one to a low health, they will stop to talk to you. Both of them can then be recruited if you have a chaotic alignment. You can actually vassalize the trolls or the kobolds. Ideally, you want to pick Tartuk, honestly. The trolls aren't going to help you out that much. Tartuk will explain that when he was resurrected from being Tartusio under the old sycamore as part of part 1, it seems to have fully transformed him into the kobold disguise he was wearing. So what was initially an illusion became his actual appearance, because when he was raised as one, it appears to have cursed him in some manner. There is a very difficult to get ending to this game where that is required knowledge. You have to pick that up, that Tartuk was cursed in some way. Basically just any and everything you can learn about curses. But we'll get into more of that at the appropriate time. Now, regardless of whether or not you have the chaotic alignment required to recruit these two as vassals to your barony, you can choose to just let them go. Now with Hergulka, you won't see him again anymore. Or her, I don't really know. If you choose to let Tartuk go, you will see him again at the very, very end of the game, regardless of whether or not you could recruit him. And that, once that situation is resolved, ends the threat of trolls to your barony, which concludes the Chapter 2 portion of the actual main story of this game. However, ideally you want to do this as quickly as possible, because this will give you the rest of the Ancient Curse timer on part 2 of it to go explore and fill out your barony. That is a running theme. As that is mostly side content, we're not really going to focus on it, and our next portion of these videos will pick up where the Ancient Curse ends for part 2 and begins chapter 3, which will be called Season of Bloom. But in the meantime, thank you guys so much for watching. I truly enjoy and love making these videos, so if anybody gets anything out of them, it means a lot to me. Can't thank you guys enough for watching. May you wander in wisdom, and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you part 3 of our Story of Pathfinder Kingmaker series. In our last episode, we completed Troll Trouble, and I was going through the interlude portion of the game until Act 3, Season of Bloom, started. So, there are 2 events in between Chapters 2 and Chapters 3, or Acts, whatever you want to call them, that are noteworthy before we jump into things. 1, while we are waiting for Chapter 3 to start, we will get Remus in our throne room. If you remember, Remus is the odd man we met as we left Oleg Trading Post for the very first time. He will be rambling about some goddess. Much like before, he's a bit of an incoherent mess. Now, truthfully, how you resolve this situation doesn't matter all that much. The main thing I want to get across here is that he is speaking about a goddess of the stolen lands. The next random event, well, not exactly random, but the next event we get in our throne room before Chapter 3 starts that is important is with one Wielis, I don't know exactly how to pronounce that name, Gunderson, and he will ask you to investigate an island that is supposedly cursed for him. Now, in this particular playthrough, I'd already been to the island and discovered what I needed to discover, so I could resolve this immediately upon him entering the throne room. Basically, you can explain that it wasn't cursed. There were just, some series of unfortunate events happening there. And more importantly, after this, he heads towards Varnhold and a section of the map called Tors of Levanese. I believe I've got that right. And what this actually is foreshadowing for an upcoming chapter. But it's important that you know that Wielis Gunderson headed towards Varnhold after this is done. Once enough in-game days have passed after we've completed Troll Trouble, eventually we will get an event in our throne room where our envoy will tell us that magic beasts are attacking the barony. But luckily, there's a group called the Embeth Travelers who have offered to essentially host a hunt and kind of show you how they specialize in dealing with these monsters. You can turn them away, you don't have to do this part, but it is kind of the introduction to Chapter 3, Season of Bloom, and there's an achievement for doing it properly, so I recommend you do so. Now, that usually happens at the same time that part 2 of our ancient curse that I mentioned in part 2 is resolving, so you'll likely have to deal with that roughly around the same time. But once we're ready, we can make our way over to the hunting lodge, which is very close to our capital, where the Imbeth travelers will explain that all of the gathered nations will essentially compete to kill the most magical beasts. Now, in actual game terms, in order to win this, we need to, in order to get the achievement, you can win it multiple ways. In order to get the achievement, you need to kill 2 of the magical beasts, saving one of the nation's envoys while you do so, and then arriving while the Imbeth travelers actually, are fighting the third one, and you need to not poach their prey from them, basically. You need to let them kill it and be done, and just win with the other 2 heads. It's important that you actually see this third monster while you are trying to get that achievement, because if you just get the 2 heads and then don't interact with the Imbeth travelers, the achievement won't pop, which is strange, but nonetheless. While we are participating in this hunt, we will likely find the goblins praising one of the beasts, or just a group of goblins praising a beast and calling out to someone named Lamashtu. The beast will eat one of the goblins and then they'll all run away. Once all of that has resolved itself, we will return to the hunting lodge from the hunting grounds, and the winner of the hunt will be announced, however that was resolved. And while that is happening, a servant nearby will explode into a monster. They will just get transformed explosively into a magical beast, which will of course then be fought by you and everyone else in the room. And this, combined with the fact that we already knew magical beasts were attacking our kingdom, clear that this is becoming a rather dire situation. So you'll have to decide what to tell the common folk of your barony. Honestly, I recommend that you don't tell the common citizens of your barony anything, but you can choose to do what you want to do here. And after this, you will have to wait until your council gathers at the capital. This usually takes a few in-game days at the very least. Now, once this council finally gathers, they'll explain that the situation is very dire. People are dying and they are transforming into magical beasts that are kind of ravaging your countryside. In addition to this, in addition to all of the beasts that is, goblins are starting to appear everywhere, praising someone they call Lamashtu, like we saw in the hunting grounds. Now, this is where we are given several leads to follow up on. So, for starters, the goblins appearing everywhere. If you kept the situation quiet, agents of your barony, shall we say, have already uncovered the location of the goblin village, where you need to, go follow up with the goblins. If you didn't keep it quiet, they were busy and you have to find the goblin village yourself. That said, it's pretty close to your capital. It shouldn't be all that difficult to find. In addition to this, Jod comes up to us and tells us that Keston, one of our head guards, has been tracking cultists of Lamashtu in the area, and he sent a letter asking you to meet him at the shrine of Lamashtu, which is south of your capital, at a very specific date, or a specific date of every week. And then lastly, Jod leads us to a surgery scene, where essentially they're performing an exploratory surgery, trying to figure out what is turning these people into beasts. Now, this is largely a text event that happens. However, I want to mention that if you manage to recruit Bartholomew Delgado from Part 2, he will actually be able to assist with this surgery scene, making it very easy. Now, you will pretty much find the cause of the transformations regardless of how this text event plays out. But you can fail it. The woman involved can die, essentially, just stuff like that. It can resolve a number of ways that don't really matter a ton. But the key information here is that we find the source of the transformations, which appears to be a seed that people are somehow ingesting, and then it is growing inside of them before it turns into a portal, which then rips the person to shreds before portaling in a monster. Now that we understand what is turning these people into monsters, they can begin to cure it. Now that the surgeries can have some focus, they can get rid of these seeds, which leaves us to follow up on our leads. Now, as we go to leave the capital, we can encounter a scene where people are scared and leaving. You can, chase them off, essentially. You can tell them to go ahead and leave. You can also use the diplomacy skill check to try to keep them here. If you are of neutral alignment, you can use that option to guaranteed keep them here as opposed to potentially failing the skill check. Truthfully, I've never seen any real ramifications to this actual choice. Kind of regardless of what happens here, I've never seen any follow-up choice or consequence to this. So just letting you know, I guess. So that brings us to the Goblin Village, which is our next place we are going to because it's right near the capital and easy to find. So once we arrive at the Goblin Village, we will find that they are herding all of these magical beasts. Now, as you enter the village, all of the goblins here aren't necessarily hostile, but they will be trying to trick you and attack you or release beasts to attack you. And you can kind of have some fun with that, but the main thing you're going to try to do here is make your way to the arena at kind of the center of the village, center like top part, where we will see a scene where the goblin village, specifically a shaman, are trying to have a specific goblin named Knock Knock executed. Knock Knock claims to be the seer of Lamashtu, and after we kill the beast that was trying to kill Knock Knock, and several of the other goblins in the area, we can speak with Knock Knock. The important information we gain here is that the goblins think their goddess, Lamashtu, sent them these beasts. They are not responsible for their appearance. They are just, enjoying their presence because they worship a deity known as Lamashtu, as I've said several times. And Lamashtu is considered the mother of monsters. So the goblins see this as a bit of a blessing and are thus trying to be respectful of the beasts and herd them, and basically just enjoy what they see as a blessing from their goddess. Now, Knock Knock can actually be a companion, so you can choose to recruit him if you so choose, and then you can decide what to do with the remaining goblins in the village. You can kill them, let them go, whatever floats your boat. Some companions will have some things to say about it, but it doesn't make much of a difference either way. Now, from here, we can follow up on the Shrine of Lamashtu that we got sent to by a letter from Keston. Now, once we arrive there, as I mentioned, you have to arrive there on a specific day, which means you might have to rest to cycle days here until you get to the appropriate day, which I believe is Moon Day, the first day of the week, they call it. Interestingly enough, you can visually tell if you're here on the right day because the two guards standing next to Keston, one of them will be up on the rock, looking past, as opposed to just standing next to Keston. So that's a weird visual cue that, you have the right day. Now, once you guys ambush the cultists of Lamashtu that then gather here at the shrine, you'll kill several of them, but one of them will get away. You'll have to chase this person, which is a text event. Now, pass or fail, you should pretty much wind up at the Secluded Lodge, which is an area right next to this on the world map. Now, from here, we'll be investigating this inn, because that's essentially what the Secluded Lodge is an inn. There are several people here. You can choose to investigate yourself or have Keston round up whoever he thinks it is. You choose to do so yourself. A very short interrogation should tell you that it is Tasana the cook, because no one's seen anyone come in, but the cook has a back door that she came in. She also has a limp, which the text event would have told us that the cultist had as well. Now, coincidentally, Tasana can be recruited as a potential advisor depending on how you resolve this situation. She is a chaotic, evil, I believe, person, however, though, so that may or may not align with you. Just letting you know that you can potentially recruit her as an advisor. That is important because she is one of the only other counselor advisors besides Tristan you can possibly get in the game, which is why I make a note to mention it. Tasana will explain after she attacks us and is defeated once we point her out as the cultist. She will explain that all the other people here in the inn have actually come here seeking the blessing of Lamashtu. So they haven't done anything illegal per se, but more importantly, Tasana also explains that she has no idea why these beasts are attacking. She is part of a cult that worships Lamashtu, but they have no knowledge of what is going on with these magical beasts attacking our kingdom. Now, from here, you can resolve the situation however you like. You can have everyone in the building executed. You can have just Tasana executed. You can have them all arrested, that kind of stuff. Whatever floats your boat. Now, once this has concluded, you will be sent back to your capital to have a second council. Now, once this council happens, from the conversation, you guys will come to realize that in addition to clearly being ingested from the surgery we saw earlier, all of the spottings of beasts seem to be along, or at least most focused, along the Gudrun River. So you guys believe that most likely the seeds are being spread down the Gudrun River, where villagers are then drinking from the river, thus becoming infected. Now, as this is going on, there will be a riot inside your throne room, or at least outside your throne room, I should say. Now, you will go outside to deal with these peasants. You can either talk your way out of this through skill checks or use a required evil or a required good option to instantly resolve it without killing anyone. You can choose to just attack the mob and kill all these peasants, but regardless, this will have to be resolved one way or the other. Now, with the information we just learned, we know that we need to head up the Gudrun River, which is like the river that meets our capital to the east. Now, what we'll actually be looking for is a goblin fort. But before we do that, I want to mention one side quest that is rather important, and that is a companion quest from Tristan. Tristan, and the side quest itself isn't necessarily important, but the content of it is, or at least one part of this side quest. Tristan will come to us in our throne room, usually right after that council meeting happens, and he'll explain that there is a cult of sorts that seems to be gaining traction in your kingdom, known as the Kingdom of the Cleansed, and he'll ask you to investigate it. And when you do that, you'll eventually be led to a clearing where the Kingdom of the Cleansed are having a meeting of sorts. Now, when you arrive there, you will see none other than Remus there preaching to the Kingdom of the Cleansed about the goddess of the Stolen Lands again, because the Kingdom of the Cleansed worship this same goddess as Remus. Now, this is especially noteworthy because you can have ordered Remus killed, including doing it once personally, twice up to this point, and he will still be here regardless, which is a bit of foreshadowing that maybe Remus has some other stuff going on. But we can't do anything more than that. I just mention it because that is when that side quest pops up. And now we will head to the Goblin Fort up along the Gudrun River. When we get there, we will meet Keston, and he and his guards are under attack by goblins. We'll fend off these goblins and we can speak to Keston. Now, he has saved a bunch of prisoners from the goblin village already, but he also tells us that for whatever reason, the goblins are bringing all of these people before a shrine of Lamashtu before taking them to the river to drink. Now, if we piece all this information together, we can, obviously figure out that what is happening here is the goblins enjoying these, beasts, as their goddess says to do, are intentionally infecting people with these seeds from the Gudrun River. Now, at this point, we can either kill all the prisoners that Keston has already saved, though Keston will not be happy about that, and we can also make a decision as we move through the Goblin Village to continue killing or saving prisoners. But keep in mind, all of these people are infected, so you kind of got a moral decision to make there. But eventually, we are going to make our way to the main part of the Goblin Fort, at which point we will have to kill the Goblin King and the Goblin Shaman. Now, as the Shaman is dying, he will explain that they've already found where the seeds are coming from, but obviously he won't tell you this. But we do get the name of it, the Womb of Lamashtu. Basically, all of these seeds are coming down the Gudrun River from this place. And he will also explain, right at this moment is when all of the seeds should be coming to fruition. So basically, everyone who's been infected or is infected should be simultaneously bursting into monsters at roughly the same time. Now, this is interesting because if we spoke with Keston and chose to save the prisoners, we've been sending them back to Keston at the beginning of the Goblin Fort. So we need to rush back to Keston at the beginning of this map and save him from whatever combination of beasts are there. Now, here is something that I actually don't like about this particular thing. If you chose to be pragmatic and kill all of the prisoners up to this point, instead of the prisoners turning, Keston's guards will turn into monsters, which I felt was kind of cheap. It's because, I clearly did the thing, and you just worked around it anyway. But regardless, you'll have to save Keston from monsters, and then you guys will have to decide what to do, because the capital is full of infected that have all decided to simultaneously burst into monsters as Chapter 3 comes to a head. Now, at this point, what Keston will want to do is go to the Womb of Lamashtu by himself and send you to the capital to defend it. If that is what you go with, someone is going to die. So, if you don't have the required lawful option to send Keston back to the capital forcefully, someone unfortunately has to die here. Because if you let Keston go to the Womb of Lamashtu, that leaves Jod unaware to defend the city by himself. And that leaves Keston with only a small group of guards he has left to go to the Womb of Lamashtu, at which point you will have to decide which one you're going to first, which will save the person, either Jod or Keston, that you go to first, and the second person that you go to will die. But if you have the required lawful option to send Keston to the capital, you can then resolve this however you so choose without any consequences like someone dying, which is obviously the recommended option if it is available to you. So from here we need to do one of two things, keeping the consequences I just mentioned in mind. We need to defend our capital, and we need to get our way into the Womb of Lamashtu. Now, we're going to start with the capital, because it is the closest to us, and in my particular case, I used the required lawful option because I'm playing a lawful evil character. So we head back to our capital. It's been destroyed. There are beasts everywhere. We need to kill all of them, save as many people as possible, and then fight our way to our castle-y fort of sorts. Now, once we get there, we need to save Highland, which is our actual captain of our city guard, which we may or may not know up to this point. You can also not talk to him, but you can also talk to him in your capital up to this point, so you may know the guy, you might not. But once you save Highland and speak to him, an absolute unit of an owlbear will come forward to attack you. Now, once you kill this owlbear, the capital will be successfully defended. Coincidentally, this owlbear was also used in a lot of the marketing, so you might see it in some of the art for Pathfinder Kingmaker sometimes. Now, once this is done, we'll need to head to the Womb of Lamashtu. Now, this is actually on the other side of Lake Silverstep up the Gudrun River. So once we follow our way up the Gudrun River, we'll eventually go across Lake Silverstep, and the Womb of Lamashtu is right there. Now, once we get into the womb, we need to fight our way to the very back of it until we wind up in a place called the First World. Essentially, while we're traveling through the womb, we'll start seeing more and more flowers and stuff come up, and the next thing we know, we'll find our way into the First World. Now, as I mentioned before, the First World was used as a bit of a rough draft for the gods as they were, working on basically what they could do and what they could create, and it is the home of all of the Fey creatures of Pathfinder. Now, while we are inside the First World, we will witness the nymph, the guardian of the bloom from the previous chapters, being cursed by an eldest, the Lantern King to be specific, though we don't know his name at this point. Now, it would appear that the guardian of the bloom has stolen something from the Lantern King. This is a vision of the past, so we don't have all the details, just to be clear. It seems the nymph stole something from the Lantern King, and as a way to make her repent for this, the Lantern King curses the nymph. She has to make 1,000 nations fall in order to remove the curse from herself, which should explain why she betrayed and is now trying to kill us, the founder of the kingdom. Now, right nearby, we will be able to pick up a bird, which you need to add to your inventory. Now, as we walk into these foggy parts of the map, it should teleport us to various places. Now, we need to do this until we find a gnome camp. Right near the gnome camp is a rock, so we need to go put the bird on that rock and then speak to the gnome. The gnome will explain a few things, but most importantly, he'll give us a magic lantern. And also importantly, the gnome here will specifically refer to the nymph as the goddess, which is where you should starting to put some of these pieces together. Because as I mentioned, the goddess of the stolen lands has come up multiple times, and this gnome refers to the nymph as the goddess. We've heard Remus and them call her goddess up to this point as well. We'll call someone goddess. So it should start becoming clear that this is all the same person. Now, after we speak to the gnome, we need to rest at his campfire. Once this is done and we come to, the bird that was on the rock should now be nothing but bones, interestingly enough. We need to grab those bones, and then we need to use the lamp we got from the gnome, which should shroud our party in a pretty obvious, mystical aura. This will allow us to pass through the big bits of fog without teleporting. Once that's done, we can find a pool, which I believe is called the Pool of Regrets. But once we approach it, we will see the nymph play out a little scene where she was lamenting what was taken from her. Because during the earlier vision, we'll have seen the eldest strip her of something. Something kind of metaphysical, it would seem. Something inside of her. Like a longing or her ability to love, maybe something like that. She, in this vision, refers to it as potentially being like her actual heart. It's left a little vague as to what specifically was taken from her, but we do see it happen. And we'll get into more of that at another time. But once we find this pool, we need to take the bird bones that we had gotten and throw them into the pool. And after this, we need to retrieve water from this pool, which will give us a vial of poisoned water. Now at this point, we need to keep searching the area until we find a flower. Now, while we're looking for it, we will actually have one more vision where we find out that the nymph had someone create what they're calling the ever-blooming flower, which is creating the seeds that is then turning all these people into monsters. So once we finally find where the flower is by deactivating our lantern at the appropriate location and walking through a cloud to teleport us to where the flower is, we'll have to kill the monsters around it and then approach it. Now, if you just destroy the flower physically, it almost immediately grows back. What you have to do is use the poison that we got from the pool using the bird bones to kill the flower. Now, once this is done, the old gnome will show back up again, and he'll explain that you have to kill this flower in both the first world and the physical world at the same time, at which point you'll have to split your party. I have Jathal with me, who gets Animate Undead as part of her side quests, which summons 4 to 6, I think it is, undead warriors for you. So what I did is I just split Jathal off by herself, but ideally you want to split the party however you so choose. Now, once this is done, you'll have to fight the monsters that are teleported in right where you are now once you speak to the gnome and let them know that you're ready to begin. And once you kill those monsters, you'll click through a portal, and then it'll skip to your split party member, in my case Jathal, and you'll have to kill a poison flytrap enemy by yourself. Once that enemy's dead, the rest of your group will join you, and you'll have to kill the rest of the monsters that are summoned in. At which point you'll be able to destroy the flower in the physical world, and after having destroyed it in the first world, will permanently destroy the ever-blooming flower, which was responsible for the seeds that were turning your people into monsters. At this point, we have to return to our capital city where we can have a quick meeting, wrapping up basically about how we're trying to undo all the damage that was done. And at this point, we are at another interlude section where you will have whatever in-game days you have left on Chapter 3 of the Ancient Curse before Chapter 4 starts, which I will be running through, obviously, in the background. And our next video will be about Chapter 4 of the main story. Thank you guys so much for watching. I truly appreciate anybody who hangs around and finds anything interesting about this kind of stuff. So truly, thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you part 4 of our Story of Kingmaker series. Last we left off, we had just dealt with the Season of Bloom chapter, and typically speaking, after you wrap that up, there's some time in between the Ancient Curse timers in which you can handle kingdom management. But obviously, these being story videos, we are going to skip right ahead to Chapter 4, which is called Varnhold Vanishing. Now, roughly 2 months prior to the end of the Chapter 3 Ancient Curse, we will receive a noble at our court looking for his missing brother. This is technically not a required main quest, though it is classified with the Varnhold Vanishing quest, and is a bit of foreshadowing to people in Varnhold being missing. Closer to the timer being up, we will get a letter from Jamandi about Varnhold no longer sending correspondences, and you being right next to them, she asks you to go investigate, which we can do. Now, I do want to take this time to mention that if you did Varnhold's Lot, or if you have a save file for Varnhold's Lot, you will be prompted to import that save once Varnhold Vanishing starts. However, you won't be able to deal with the ramifications of your choices in that DLC until after this chapter is over. So the first thing we want to do is, of course, head straight to Varnhold. That said, the second we go to leave our capital for the first time after receiving that letter from Jamandi, we will be pulled into a meeting with the nymph where we can speak to her and basically explain that we know that she's been cursed due to our trip to the first world in Chapter 3. And then this meeting can kind of have some back and forth, and you get some dialogue and extra character development for her. Making our way to Varnhold. Once we arrive there, we find that the town is empty, but as we make our way to the fort of the city, we can find that there are Spriggans all over the place. And as we make our way to their leader, we might also see ravens watching us everywhere. Now, once we make it inside the main fort of Varnhold, we can speak to the chieftain of the Spriggans. Now, if you have some diplomacy skill, you can find out that these Spriggans were actually chased from their cave, and they came to Varnhold, which was already empty when they got there. You can kill the chieftain, spare him, get this information. It's possible to miss this information and have to look for the cave that we're going to next. But basically, the Spriggans were chased out of their cave by a group of humans and then came to Varnhold. So the next thing we can follow up on is going to that cave to see who kicked the Spriggans out. Now, on our way out of the fort, a raven will stop to speak to us. And it won't have much to say besides calling the people of Varnhold thieves, and then it just kind of runs off. Now this brings us to the Overgrown Cavern, which is where the Spriggans were from. I do want to point out this weird, dialogue inconsistency. When you're speaking to the Spriggans, they say they were kicked out of their cave to the north, though the Overgrown Cavern that is marked on your map when you pass the checks talking to the Spriggans is to the south of Varnhold. So I don't know if that's just a mistake in the dialogue or what, but we actually go to the Overgrown Cavern to the south, not the north. Now, we find the Overgrown Cavern full of barbarians. This chapter is where having a Miri in your party is actually pretty helpful. Because if you have a Miri in your party, she can just speak to the barbarians at the gate and they'll just let you in and you don't have to pass any checks. Now they will explain that they are the Tiger Lord tribe if we actually take the time to talk to them. And we can ask about Varnhold. They will have no idea what happened. They were actually here looking for ruins or something because their leader, Dugoth, and the sisters have sent them out on this mission. You can ask Bolga, the leader of the barbarians in this cave, and she can kind of explain a few things. The sisters she mentioned are actually witches in service of Armag, the Tiger Lord's chieftain. And she can actually explain some things about their chieftain, Armag Twiceborn. Armag was once a warrior of old who supposedly was killed by Pharasma, the goddess of death herself, and according to Bolga here, has recently come back to life. But that is actually just foreshadowing, and we'll circle back around to that later. The main thing we get from Bolga is that the barbarians have a camp nearby, which is where we should head next, because she posits that the sisters might know something about Varnhold. Now, once we come up to the barbarian camp, we're going to get hit with a text event at first. If you have Amiri with you, you can pretty much automatically pass this, but you do get some dialogue regardless here. So during this text event, you might notice a defaced sister in the text event, and then after it, there will be an argument between Dugoth and the defaced sister that is in camp. So Dugoth will explain that he doesn't know what happened to Varnhold. The Tiger Lords are here helping the sisters look for whatever it is they're looking for, but they don't know exactly what it is, because the sisters won't tell them. And if you speak to the defaced sister, she will explain that her sisters are missing. There's actually 3 others here. That if you can find her 3 sisters, collectively they might be able to tell you kind of what happened to Varnhold. And she will also give you a special magic word of sorts that will open up Cyclops doors, because all of the ruins around here are from the ancient Cyclops Empire, which died out long before this game ever started. So our goal after we leave the camp is to find the other 3 defaced sisters, and now we have the word to open Cyclops doors that is going to allow us to do this. The defaced sister says that the word she gives us is actually the Cyclops word for darkness, as they are evil creatures. So apparently that was like a commonly used password for them or something. Now we have to find these defaced sisters to carry on. The easiest one to start with is to the south. It is the Forsaken Mound. This is purely a text event. If you pass it, you'll find out that the sister is dead, and you can actually use this text event to see the take off the mask that are covering the defaced sister's face. And this is where you find out that A, they literally don't have a face, so defaced is very a real thing to say. Moreover, you can note that they are Fae. They are not barbarians like the rest of the barbarians that are with the Tiger Lords here, but it's important to note that they're Fae, so you might not want to trust them up to this point. Now from here, we can head to the City of Hollow Eyes, which is actually to the north of the barbarians' camp. We can meet a barbarian Hilla here, who is helping the defaced sister that was sent here look for the artifact. But Hilla is mostly concerned with her barbarians at the moment, as they are fighting Cyclopses around the area. If you go and help some of these Cyclopses and tell Hilla afterwards what happened with the defaced sister, she'll give you some gold. But our main goal here is to find the defaced sister, which is in the tomb or barrow or whatever you want to call it, to the northern end of this map. Now once we get there, we can use the magic word to open the Cyclops door and enter the tomb to speak to the defaced sister. You can choose to kill this woman, or basically, free her now that she's not in imminent threat of dying to undead Cyclopses, and she will head back to the barbarian camp, which is what the other defaced sister in camp asked us to do. Now if you kill her, you get an incense burner, as well as an incense burner from the woman at the Forsaken Mound. Now this brings us to the Sepulchre of Forgotten Heroes, which is actually just a puzzle dungeon, which involves pressing a bunch of buttons, and some are timed, some aren't, and opening doors around this dungeon. It's probably my least favorite dungeon in the game, to be honest. But we can find that barbarians were led here by one of the defaced sisters, where they were ultimately mind-controlled by these undead Cyclopses here, and it would seem the defaced sister brought them here to die. So once we make our way to the defaced sister, after speaking to a dying barbarian who gave us this information, we can again choose to kill her or spare her. If you have Amiri with you still at this point, she will definitely want to kill this defaced sister for getting a bunch of barbarians killed. After this, we've found all 3 defaced sisters. We need to head back to the barbarian camp so we can go speak to the sisters, ideally, about what happened to Varnhold. It's worth mentioning that up to this point I actually recommended that you killed some of the defaced sisters, and the reason why is when you return to camp, all of the defaced sisters that are still alive, which is a maximum of 3, but potentially only 1, will essentially try to get Dugoth and his barbarians to kill you, saying that you are the reason all of their sisters are dead. Even if you didn't actually kill any of them, this will happen. because as we've found while exploring it, these witches are actually fae, and they're not really helping these barbarians any. They're essentially using the barbarians as fodder as they search for some artifact that is supposed to be nearby. If we killed some of the sisters, which is what Dugoth subtly hinted at that he wanted, we actually can pass a religion check during this conversation to basically say, like, aren't you guys tired of following these witches who are just getting you killed kind of stuff? Like, it's not really what their god Gorum is all about. And you can potentially persuade about half the camp to help you, instead of following the witches in their attempt to kill you. So if you've killed all the witches up to this point, this is actually not all that difficult, because you can then persuade Dugoth to help you, and then you're only dealing with like half the barbarians in the camp, as well as just one defaced sister. If you kept all of them alive, you don't seem to get the option to persuade Dugoth to help you, so you have to fight like the entire camp plus the sisters. Also, you will run into Dugoth a little later in the next chapter if he lives. Now, regardless of how this pans out, after this fight is over, you'll get a chance to speak to Dugoth, potentially before he dies, and he'll explain that they actually already found the place that they believe the item the sisters were looking for is. Dugoth just didn't want to send his people there to what he figured would probably be death. So he'll mark it on your map for you. It's known as the Valley of the Dead. We could have gotten some incense burners up to this point. Otherwise, they are on the defaced sisters' bodies if they were all alive. You need to loot all three of these Cyclops incense burners off of their corpses, because we're going to need them in just a minute. But before we actually head to the Valley of the Dead, I want to talk about something. There is, as I mentioned a little earlier, a raven that has been following us around. You'll speak to him at various points throughout this little bit of exchanges, and he really doesn't have much to add. He's just in general being annoying, calling you thieves, saying he works for some master. If your name comes up, it cuts to the raven, and it like flies off with your name. So I'm going to go ahead and spoil this a little bit before we actually get to the part where it's important. The raven is actually a soul eater. Soul eaters are stronger if they know your name. At first, I thought potentially, once I played through the game and saw that these were soul eaters, maybe if you withheld your name, you would be helping yourself out in the long run. That's not true. Actually, as it turns out, the raven will no matter what find out your name, which feels cheap, because they clearly try to make it like you don't have to give it your name, or there's ways to like hide your name, and there's just not. This raven will learn your name regardless, because even if you do all of that hiding, when you go to the barbarian camp and the defaced sisters accuse you, they will say that they've learned your name, even if you've kept it hidden up to that point, and then the raven overhears this, which I think is just a cheap move, to be honest. Now, on our way to the Valley of the Dead, we will be stopped in a random event that is mandatory, meaning you can't evade it. So when you go into it, you will speak to the raven, where his master, who he names as Vortikai, formally invites you into his lair, because apparently what the raven has been doing up to this point has been gathering information on the New World, because Vortikai has been long dead, much like the Cyclops Empire. It would seem he was awoken by something and has just been finding out information. So this is obviously our best lead as to what happened to Varnhold, and it's an evil undead Cyclops Lich, so we could probably investigate. Now right after this, if Tristan is not in our party, he will appear to us saying that he knows the Valley of the Dead as being a great place of evil, and he wishes to accompany you on your trip to the Valley of the Dead. So you can choose to take Tristan with you or not. Now, once we arrive at the Valley of the Dead, there will be a gate blocking our way. Now, you can come here early and try to use the word that the defaced sisters give you to open this door, but it won't work. What you actually need to do is take the incense burners, hang them on the door, then speak the word, which will then open the Valley of the Dead door. And then we can make our way through the Valley of the Dead to Vortikai's tomb. Vortikai's tomb is a giant pain in the ass. So if you have not been paying attention to mechanics, this is where the game is going to punish you. Because even if you know what you're doing, this is a long dungeon, it can be a huge pain if you're just not prepared for it. And in my experience, is typically where most people who are new to Pathfinder and this game tend to fall off. This is a rough dungeon. So once you step into it and you talk to the Raven, who will meet you at the door, and ask him like if you're ready to go in, he'll open the door for you, but he'll also close the exit. which means save scumming is pretty much your only options at this point. So you need to bring a lot of rations with you so you can rest because you can't hunt in dungeons, as well as just generally be prepared for a long haul. This is a long dungeon. It's probably the first real challenge of the game. Now, as we make our way through this dungeon, we're going to speak to this raven several more times, where he'll ask the name of our companions, and even if we don't give it to him, for whatever reason, your companions pipe up and offer their names instead. Again, pointing out that you just cannot keep these guys from getting your names, which I think is annoying. Additionally, as we're making our way through this tomb, we will learn about an artifact called the Oculus of Abaddon, which it would seem is the relic that the defaced sisters were actually looking for here. And on the end portion of this first floor is where you'll run into the Soul Eaters I've mentioned. Now this is where the Soul Eater will pop up. It will speak the names of at least 3 of your companions, 2 plus yourself usually, and then you will go into a battle with those Soul Eaters. So what them knowing your name allows you to do means that if they speak your name, the only person that can fight the Soul Eater that spoke your name is you. So you can't use minions, you can't use anybody but yourself to fight the Soul Eater that said your name. There is no way around that. You just have to be strong enough to kill the thing, which isn't too difficult. They're just regular Soul Eaters as opposed to the more powerful variant of ancient Soul Eaters. But nonetheless, once the ones who shouted your name are dead, you'll then have a fight with 4 ancient Soul Eaters. And as you might see, the room right before this, I actually made a mistake against 2 of the giant Cyclopses that you can fight, and I got Amiri killed, so she'll be dead for the rest of this dungeon. But it doesn't really matter, as that fight with those Cyclopses is honestly the hardest fight in here. Now, on the second floor, we can encounter 2 things of note. One, we will have to fight a mage as we enter the second floor, called Cephal Laurentis. He is from Varnhold's lot. If you're wondering why there's just a random named enemy in here, he's from the DLC. And then we will eventually come across the ghost of none other than Wiles Gunderson, or Wiles Gunderson. I don't know how to say this guy's name. It's weird. If we chase his ghost down a hallway where we have to fight a ton of undead, we can eventually speak to him. And Wiles will explain that he is accidentally responsible for waking up Vorticai. As it would turn out, the nymph, who has been causing us much destruction, as we found out in Chapter 3, is actually not responsible for this, which means that what she told us at the beginning of this chapter, where she will say that she knows who's responsible for Varnhold vanishing, but it wasn't her, it turns out she was actually telling us the truth, because Wiles Gunderson stole a bracelet from Vorticai's tomb, which inadvertently woke him up. When Vorticai woke up, he needed to basically take stock of what the world was like now, so he sent Wiles and other people he found under his mind control using the Oculus of Abaddon, which is a dark artifact from the 4 Horsemen of the Apocalypse, specifically Sharon. They rule an evil realm called Abaddon, hence the Oculus of Abaddon. So Vorticai, using the Oculus of Abaddon, sent Wiles to Varnhold, where he then followed and used Oculus of Abaddon, or at least its power, he didn't actually go there physically, it would seem, to mind control every single person in Varnhold and force them to make their way to Vorticai's tomb. This is where Vorticai used the Oculus's power to comb through all of these people's memories and stuff and just kind of acclimate himself to the world, which is in theory where a lot of these undead warriors we're fighting came from. Now after that, we'll actually be pretty close to Vorticai himself. There's just a couple more rooms in between Wiles and Vorticai. Now, ironically enough, once you get to Vorticai, we'll have that conversation. But I just want to mention that ironically, when you get to him, Vorticai is one of the easier fights in this dungeon. If you can get to Vorticai, you can kill Vorticai. Now, you can have a conversation with Vorticai at the start, but basically he's just aggressive, so the fight starts. Once you get Vorticai down to half health, if Tristan is not with you, he will teleport into the room. At which point he will steal Vorticai's eye, which is actually the Oculus of Abaddon, which Vorticai had to cut out his own eye to replace because the Oculus has to be put in someone's eye socket to be of use. So Tristan effectively betrays us by taking this artifact, and then he teleports away and leaves the party, if you had him in your party, and leaves your companions if he was in your companions, and seemingly betrayed you. Now, once this is done, we have to finish killing Vortikai. Again, not a very difficult thing to do. But once we get him down, here's where the options start popping up. So, if you are an evil character, it is possible to recruit Vortikai as an advisor. He actually will give you a little bit of information about a quest later on, which is about the only benefit of doing so. But just letting you know it's an option. You can recruit Vortikai as an advisor if you have an evil character. However, even if you are evil, I don't really recommend doing this, because if you do so, you have to sacrifice Magar Varn. And if you sacrifice Magar Varn, you don't get all the Varnhold's Lot DLC follow-up if you took Vortikai as an advisor, because all of the follow-up from your DLC choices hinges on Magar Varn coming and speaking to you after Varnhold vanishing. Do what you will there, just keep in mind if you want Vortikai as an advisor, it requires you to sacrifice Magar Varn's essence, thus making him unsavable. As Vortikai is dying, we can free Magar Varn's soul essence from a bottle nearby, which will pop Magar Varn back into existence. He'll be kind of disoriented, and we'll need to go into the next room, where it would seem the essence of all the rest of the souls of Varnhold are. And we can choose to take all of these back to Capital and sell them, which is an evil thing to do, or we can set them free, which is what I recommend you do. Regardless of alignment, if you don't set these people free, you then have to repopulate Varnhold if you want to do anything with it kingdom management-wise. Because right after you exit this and you go to exit the dungeon, you speak to Magar Varn, and he willingly allows your barony to annex his barony. So if you chose to bring all of the essence back to your capital and sell it, you will then have to spend a bunch of kingdom resources on repopulating Varnhold. So I honestly recommend you just save Magar, save all of his people, even if you're playing an evil character. You can actually, for the most part, avoid good choices while still getting to that outcome, so it's not necessarily like a counterintuitive roleplay thing to do either. But after this, we head to our capital and we wrap up Varnhold vanishing, because now we know what happened to Varnhold, and we managed to save the day. That said, unlike the previous chapters, after you finish Varnhold vanishing, you don't get the grace period normally, where you can wait until the next chapter starts. Regardless of how many days are left on the chapter or part 4 of the Ancient Curse, chapter 5 will start immediately, which is known as the Twice-Born Warlord, which I won't get into until the next video because that's the point of these videos. I just want to mention that unlike previous chapters, the next chapter starts immediately once you get back to your capital from defeating Vortikai. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you part 5 of our story of Pathfinder Kingmaker series. And last we left off, we had just finished off Vortikai. As I mentioned at the end of our part 4 video, the next part of the story starts immediately upon returning to your capital, which is unusual because normally you play out what's left of the timer on the Ancient Curse. The exception to that is chapter 5. Now, before we get into it, I do want to make one slight addendum to my last video that I forgot to mention. When Tristan is either with you or teleports into the room where Vortikai is, if you have done some very specific things, it is possible to make him destroy the Oculus of Abaddon instead of stealing it, but he does still leave at that point. That is important for reasons we're about to get into. Once you leave Vortikai's tomb, head back to your capital, the next chapter starts, which is kicked off by Castle, I cannot pronounce these people's names. But regardless, he will tell you that Jamandi has sent us a missive saying that the Numerian barbarians are marching on Restov, and she needs help immediately to head off their advance. You also simultaneously get word that something is going on at Lake Candlemere with the Bloom, which is a solid lead for where Tristan might have ran off to. And you are told to go track one of these leads down. So here's the thing. These two things are exclusive to each other, time-wise, meaning doing one first changes the other one. So because of that, for this part of the story, I actually kind of have to explain these choices, because what happens in Vortikai's tomb, as well as this follow-up chapter, has huge implications on the end of the game. So we're going to run through basically what doing each one first tells you. If we go to Lake Candlemere and investigate what happens with Tristan first, we will get to talk to him when we go to Lake Candlemere. We won't learn much. Essentially, we'll just learn that he's actually a Deva who has fallen from grace from Sarenrae, his goddess, who he quite literally served, not just as a cleric, but like as one of her hands, so to speak. At which point he will run off, and we will have to chase him, and we will catch a vision through the portal he runs through of a temple with a stag head, otherwise known as the Temple of the Elk, which is where we have to follow up. At the Temple of the Elk, we will be able to enter the first world, run through a bit of a dungeon where we can find Tristan and Nerissa. So after this dungeon, you'll come to Tristan and Nerissa. So it turns out, as we'll learn from this conversation, that the Guardian of the Bloom that has been hounding us and causing our barony all this trouble, her name is actually Nerissa. It turns out that she managed to lie to and corrupt, in a way, Tristan. The details on that are a little vague, but essentially she lied to him and convinced him that she had cut him off from his goddess and somehow turned him into a mortal being as opposed to a deva. And she used that leverage to convince Tristan to do things for her, such as help her plant the ever-blooming flower from Chapter 3 in 2 worlds simultaneously. That's how it was growing in the first world, as well as Galerion, which is the Pathfinder world. So basically, Tristan has been her spy this whole time. Now, the more important thing, because we learn this information pretty much regardless of when we come to this part of the quest, however, what we do learn extra if we come here first is that the reason Tristan stole the Oculus of Abaddon from Vortikai was so he could give it to Nerissa, who could use it to find hidden things, which is like the main thing that the Oculus of Abaddon does. It reveals hidden things. And while we don't know it just yet, she is looking for something very specific. The only way to keep her from finding it herself, which I will actually get into in the next part of this series, but for now, just know that the only way to keep her from getting it herself is to have done the specific things to make Tristan destroy the Oculus instead of stealing it. It does not ruin anything. If Tristan does steal the artifact instead of destroying it, you can still complete the secret ending, which is like the true ending as it tends to be called. But suffice to say, if Nerissa gets her hands on the Oculus of Abaddon, that ending becomes more difficult. Not impossible, but more difficult. So ideally, you want to have Tristan destroy the artifact, but it's not a huge deal if he doesn't. It just makes something that we'll get into a little later more difficult that I'll cover more in the next chapter. Because it's not revealed here, so I don't want to reveal it in full. But just know that if we come here first, we get all this information about who Nerissa actually is, and that she had the Oculus of Abaddon, found, because she wants it to use it to find something very specific that has been hidden from her. Now at this point we can deal with Tristan, regardless of when we came here, and we can kind of, decide what we want to do with him. You can kill him. The best thing to do is spare him, which I highly recommend you do because he is the best counselor in the game, and chances are, depending on your actions, he might be your only option as the counselor, which is a kingdom management thing. So if you kill Tristan, there's a very real possibility of you leaving yourself without an advisor for a position, which needless to say is absolutely crippling in terms of kingdom management. Now, the only other thing that we learn if we come here first and speak to Nerissa is that she is the person who manufactured everything going on with the Defaced Sisters. In the last part, we learned that the Defaced Sisters were actually, Fae and everything. Well, in this conversation, we learned that there was actually 8 of them, and that they had collectively raised a human that they named Armag, filled him with a bunch of stories about how he was the Armag of old reborn, and then sent him to the Numerian barbarians to lead. So Nerissa has orchestrated everything going on with the barbarians attacking Restov, as well as sending the Defaced Sisters with the barbarians to the area of Dunsword of the Stolen Plains to look for, or the Stolen Lands, to look for the Oculus of Abaddon. So Nerissa is behind all of that. However, she was not behind Vortikai waking up. So that brings us to our next part. The other part of this, as I mentioned, was Jamandi sent a request for aid in heading off the barbarian army headed towards Restov, which is the seat of the Aldori Swordlord's power in Brevoy. Now, this part is actually heavily tied in with Amiri's quest. So while doing Tristan's part first won't necessarily break Amiri's side quest, it becomes infinitely more difficult. And if you're playing on automatic, it's actually very likely to go ahead and break it still. Chapter 5 and the auto kingdom management mode do not play super well together. Suffice to say, the best option is honestly to go to Jamandi's side first and then go track Tristan down. Because if you already know all of the information about what Narissa is looking for outside of the game, then having that knowledge on your person, in your own head, basically gives you everything you would have gotten from going there first. So the best option is kind of really to go help Jamandi first. If you go there first, you'll actually be stopped by a group of barbarians, a small group led by a man named Gwart, I believe it is, and he explains that a lot of the Tiger Lords think that Armag, resurrected apparently Armag, is not actually that great of a leader, and they would like him gone. So Amiri's side quest involves her, being a barbarian, sneaking into Armag's barbarian camp and basically saving her friend Nilak, which is part of her side quest, as well as challenging Armag to a one-on-one fight. She won't actually be able to kill him, but it is possible to win, which affects her side quest. But suffice to say, her saving Nilak is all that needs to happen for her side quest to continue, and we'll get into why that's important for all your companions later on, but I'm just kind of explaining that nuance. So once that is done, regardless of how it plays out, it will cut back to your group, speaking with Jamandi this time instead of being stopped by a guy named Gwart. If you arrived at the battlefield first, Jamandi will basically ask for your help on the battlefield. You will do exactly that. You'll help her fight the barbarians and the giants they seem to have aligned with somehow. And once you get to the camp, you find out that Armag, apparently learning the location of the tomb of the original Armag, essentially fled the battlefield with the defaced sisters and just left his army high and dry in the middle of this fight, thus making the Aldori Swordlords here the winners of this fight, which of course is helpful if you want to remain loyal to Jamandi. Let's say you do this part second. When you show up to the battlefield, if you've done the second, you still run into Gwart like normal. However, once you get to Jamandi, you learn that her army has just been absolutely decimated. Armag will still have fled after learning the location of the tomb of the original Armag. However, most of Jamandi's forces will have been lost. Now this is important because if you remember in previous parts of this series, we talked about the political situation in Brevoy, where the Aldori Swordlords and House Sertova were basically in a tense standoff, kind of a mutually assured destruction situation, with each of them trying to gain the upper hand on the other. Jamandi losing most of her forces to the barbarians essentially is handing House Sertova the win. But we will get into that in a little bit. Regardless of how this plays out when you arrive there, what you'll wind up doing is routing the barbarian forces that are left here in the Flintlock grasslands, which this is actually happening. And when you go to leave, you will confront both Natalia Sertova as well as Jamandi Aldori, the leader of both House Sertova and the Aldori Swordlords. Now, this is a very fun part because, again, regardless of whether you showed up here first, they will decide that you've done so well here that they're deciding to not only grant you, your barony, but you'll essentially become king of this new realm of yours. So your barony will become a kingdom. Now this is where showing up to the battlefield second actually doesn't end well, because you can choose basically where you want to sit within the political strife that I just mentioned. Now if you showed up late, you basically absolutely cannot side with Jamandi because she'll flat out refuse to side with you because you let her forces be destroyed. The evil option is to in fact side with House Sertova, which you can do without being evil, but it is decidedly the evilish option. Alternatively, as a required neutral choice, you can become a peacekeeper of sorts between the two nations, which is the best option for the long-term success of the country of Brevoy. Or, alternatively, you can essentially deny being allies with either of them and decide that you don't need their permission to become king and you just do it, which weirdly enough Natalia Sertova backs anyway, which is strange. Until you realize that the whole point of your barony existing was to give Jamandi allies, and if you're not giving Jamandi allies, then that also kind of helps House Sertova. But they will explain that in order to crown you king, you first need to deal with the Bloom, which you will have done with Tristan. That's all you got to do, is you just got to go track down Tristan and deal with that side quest. And then you also need to deal with Armag, because he fled the battlefield with the defaced sisters that were still alive, to the location of the tomb of Armag, which he had learned. Now, at this point, you will need to return to your capital, where you'll have a quick meeting with Lindsay about, where to find the tomb of Armag yourself. She will suggest some options, but essentially it comes down to two things. You can find some books in the little dungeon area where you find Tristan, which will open up a kingdom event, which will give you more information about where to find Armag's tomb. The second thing about this is that there is an event in a specific place in Glenabond, which is the region where Armag's tomb is, that you can run into. It's a text event, and if you complete this text event, it's like an old man in a boat or something. And once you've completed this text event, you have an increased chance to just naturally find Armag's tomb, which is exactly what doing the kingdom event does as well. It just greatly lowers the DC on the perception check on the map to find Armag's tomb. Doing either one of these lowers it enough to where you might actually be able to do it. Technically, it's possible to just find this tomb without doing either of these, but the perception check on the map is just insanely high. But basically what you want to do here is complete those events if necessary and pass the perception check to find Armag's tomb on the world map just a little southwest of the Flintlock grasslands, actually. So once we come to the tomb itself, we'll actually find a bunch of barbarians gathered out there. And if you speak to them, they're actually a bit conflicted because most of them don't trust the defaced sisters. They're not sure how to feel about Armag fleeing a battle when he was trying to advance his armies on Restov. And then even if he was successful in fighting them off, he still just doesn't follow through with that at all. And there is a defaced sister guarding the tomb. Now, it is possible to pass a diplomacy check and get the barbarians to fight the defaced sister with you, but even if you kill her solo without their help, that no one really cares that the defaced sisters are gone. Most of the barbarians left don't trust them. Now, if Dugoth was still alive at the end of Chapter 4, when you dealt with his camp, then he will likely show up in the barbarian camp before we left the grasslands, but he will show up again in a more important role here in a little bit, which is why I mentioned this at this time. And then we want to make our way through Armag's tomb. Truthfully, kind of just a standard dungeon run. There's like a little trap gauntlet that was interesting, but for the most part, it's just a standard dungeon run. And at the end of it, you of course come to Armag. However, right before you get there, you'll actually meet a guy named Zorik, who was a cleric of Gorum, the barbarian god, who served the real Armag in life. And he has a bit of a test for you, basically to see if you're worthy of entering the tomb. You can pass a bunch of diplomacy checks and stuff to basically be allowed in and pass this guy, but even if you have to fight him, he's super weak, so I don't really understand what the challenge here was. But either way, once you deal with Zorik, you can go on to the next room here and speak to Armag, or at least attempt to speak to Armag. Here's the thing, finding this tomb is actually a little bit timed as well. So if you arrive at Armag's tomb and talk to him before a certain amount of time has passed, you'll get a different result than if that time has passed and then you find Armag's tomb. So essentially, what Armag was doing, as we're about to learn, in searching for this tomb, was he needed to reunite with the actual Armag, in his words. Essentially, the defaced sisters have told this guy his entire life that he was Armag, despite that obviously not actually being true. Armag was losing the battle to, go to Restov one way or the other. He realized he couldn't advance on Restov. He just didn't have the forces. So in realizing that, as well as learning the location of Armag's tomb, he decides that he needs to go there so he can reunite with his soul, as he likes to put it. Because on expressing this to the defaced sisters, apparently they just told him this. Now what this is actually doing is that when he picks up the ancient Armag's sword from this tomb, the actual Armag's soul is trapped in that sword. And upon picking that sword up, the current Armag had everything revealed to him by the old Armag. So, obviously very upset with this information, the current Armag murders the defaced sisters and everything, like we saw when we walked into the room, and then attacks you. So, the difference between getting here on time and getting here later is A, the difficulty of the fight, but B, if we wait too long, the soul of the actual Armag possesses the real, the current Armag, and thus he becomes unsavable. However, if you arrive here on time, the fight is a little easier, as well as giving you the opportunity to spare the current Armag, who has for his entire life been lied to and used by Nerissa and her defaced sisters. So it is very possible, if you arrived here on time, to spare Armag and, give him the chance at a life he, never got up to this point, which I think is probably the nicest ending for Armag himself, but you can also choose to kill him as well and put the poor guy out of his misery. But either way, we will have solved the crisis and put an end to the threat of the Numerian barbarians to your kingdom, as well as the kingdom of Brevoy. Now, upon exiting the tomb, we will be confronted by the Tiger Lords. Now, this conversation can go a few different ways depending on, is Armag alive, for starters. But there will be a lot of conflict about whether or not to split the tribe into two people. Some people, especially if Armags are alive, definitely wants to, keep him as chieftain, whereas some people don't because he fled a battlefield. If Dugoth is alive, he'll have some things to say about it. Gwart has some things to say about it. If Amiri's with you, she can have some things to say about it. This is a very complex conversation, but ultimately, it all results in the same endings. You can offer some of the Tiger Lords a place in your kingdom. You can basically tell all of them to get the hell out and go back to Numeria, or you can involve yourself and kind of, give them advice on who should be chieftain, whether that's Armag, Dugoth, or Gwart. But regardless of your choices here, once we're done, we can head back to our capital, where we will be crowned as king of our brand new full-blown kingdom, as opposed to just a barony. And that pretty much wraps up part 5, guys. So we won't get into part 6 and chapter 6 until after the ancient curse has blown through part 4, if you were still on that timer, because like I said, the Twiceborn Warlord chapter begins immediately after Varnhold Vanishing, so it's very possible to complete Twiceborn Warlord while you're still on Ancient Curse Part 4. So you'll still have to run through all of that timer, as well as the Part 5 timer, until you get to Chapter 6, which can leave you quite a very long chunk of time to focus exclusively on kingdom management, which is very helpful. I do want to mention before we wrap this up, the ending of Chapter 4 and how you deal with Tristan and Vorticai, as well as Chapter 5 here, has just a ton of decisions that greatly impact the ending of the game. A lot of the decisions about ending slides and stuff gets decided right here. But we will talk more about that at the appropriate time. In the meantime, thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate all the support everyone's been giving the channel. So I truly appreciate absolutely anybody who watches this stuff, especially if you get made it this far. Regardless, thank you again. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you part 6 of our story of Pathfinder Kingmaker series. In this episode, we'll be discussing Chapter 6, War of the River Kings. In between Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, there is really only one interesting thing that happens as we wait for Chapter 6 to start, and that is that Tristan will explain his involvement in opening the portals that the Ancient Curse operates through. So with the Ancient Curse timer that's always in the background of everything we do in this game, after a set period of time, usually between 6 months to a year of in-game time, a portal will open and flood our barony, or our kingdom, with monsters that kill a bunch of people and cause us problems. And as we learned just last chapter, that Tristan was actually helping Nerissa, the nymph behind most of our troubles. He will take the next passing of the Ancient Curse to explain his involvement in that if he is still alive or with us. And to quickly sum it up, while he's not directly responsible for the monsters coming through, he is responsible for giving Nerissa access to a more stable portal to send forces through, which I thought was interesting, so I figured I'd share it. Now, Chapter 6 properly starts a little while before the beginning of the Ancient Curse Part 6, in which Lindsay will explain that we are being invited to the Rushlight Tournament. The Rushlight Tournament is a kind of festival of sorts held by Pitax, which is a kingdom to our west, which up to this point in the game has sent Tartusio at the beginning of the game to kind of cause all of those problems that he wound up causing in the earlier parts of this series, as well as a few dignitaries of sorts to and from our kingdom. We'll have interacted with them a little bit, and basically all of our encounters are decidedly negative. But now that we've been crowned king, we're invited to this tournament that's held every few years. Now, while you don't actually have to accept the invitation to this kingdom, it is a pretty fun event. And if nothing else, if you go there, you can actually get amazing stuff from the vendors there. There are some very good items that are definitely worth it, especially if you're playing a kineticist. There is a headpiece there that is phenomenal. Once we go to the Rushlight tournament in the Rushlight fields of Pitax, now that we're actually able to go there, because up to this point, if you tried to enter Pitax, you would have been turned away. But upon arriving, we'll be greeted by King Irovedi, who is immediately described as being kind of gross, in my opinion. So they describe him as like having greasy hair and like oily stains and stuff all over his clothes, and just generally kind of a gross, not well-kept dude. But anyways, as the tournament carries on, we can explore the grounds, kind of interact with a few people, but mostly we need to talk to Nunzio Arpea to actually kick off the tournament. And it consists of 2 text events, which you can pass or fail, which will result in you either winning those particular branches of the tournament or not. And then there is the melee, which is the last event of the tournament. Now the melee, unless you are a monk who is spec'd into fist fighting, you're probably not going to win this unless your difficulty's impossibly low, because it is a bare knuckle brawl in which you have no armor on. So very difficult to win unless you're actually spec'd into unarmed for whatever class you're playing. But after this happens, King Irovedi will hold a speech to announce the winner of the tournament if you don't just leave outright. And throughout this speech, he will basically try to humiliate you and talk trash about your kingdom, and you can attempt to pass diplomacy checks to circumvent this happening. And then the winner will be announced, which, may or may not be you, and then you can head back to your capital after that. Now, this is where a few different things start to happen here, and not necessarily in a ton of order, but I will try to make it make sense as best I can, but keep in mind the next few events might not necessarily happen consecutively. So after some time passes, you'll eventually be contacted by Lindsay again upon visiting your throne room. And she will explain that gangs of bandits have been raiding your kingdom from the Pitax side of the border. Monsters have just been randomly appearing throughout the entire of your kingdom, going crazy until they're put down, as well as bards from Pitax sowing dissent at your borders. Now, Lindsay points out the obvious in that King Irovedi is clearly responsible for this. He brought you to the Rushlight tournament to kind of sum up, you as a ruler, and instead of attacking you outright with armies, he's trying to sow discord through your kingdom, which he's pretty successfully doing at this point. Interestingly enough, if you attended the Rushlight tournament, the severity of this will actually vary a little bit depending on how well you handled yourself at the event, and of course depending on which of the checks you passed. Did you win the tournament? Did you successfully pass the checks to call Irovedi on his trash talk? Things like that. So what this ultimately boils down to is solving 3 separate problems, dealing with the bards, the bandits, and the monsters being teleported in. Now you can take care of this in 2 ways, and I highly recommend one of them. Basically, each one of these problems is a specific little icon on the world map in Pitax. So all you really have to do is go there, find where it is, and then handle the associated problem at the associated place. Alternatively, if you don't want to explore Pitax, you can use your kingdom management screen if you're playing on not auto mode to solve events that will basically kind of tell you where this stuff is coming from. They'll investigate kind of stuff. I highly recommend that you actually just go explore Pitax because it's way faster than kingdom management. Because the other side of this coin is, while each of these things are going on, you will be getting problem event cards if you're not playing on auto mode for your kingdom management, where basically all the problems they're causing are causing, actual problems for your kingdom that you as the ruler need to solve. And the longer that takes, the more problems you're more likely to fail, thus causing you a great deal of issues. So with those things in mind, let's start with dealing with the bards, because you can actually learn about the bards at the Rushlight tournament. You can talk to Anamid Bellavara, as well as the headmaster of the Academy of Arts that King Irovedi has installed in his kingdom of Pitax. Because apparently, King Irovedi was actually a bard before he became king. But at the Rushlight tournament, we can learn that King Irovedi is using his Academy of Arts basically more as a disinformation and propaganda machine than actually patroning the arts through it. And we'll learn at the tournament that this is happening in Little Town. So while we're exploring Pitax, we can actually find Little Town if it hasn't been marked on our map already from that conversation at the tournament. Now, once you go there, you'll have to kill all of the bards and Pitax soldiers that are hanging around the inside part of the town, and then you can head to the inn where you can pass a diplomacy check if you learned about things at the Rushlight tournament to potentially turn some of the bards to your favor. There is also a required, I believe it is neutral option to do the same thing. And then you'll have to fight whoever's left that doesn't agree. Once this is dealt with, the bards sowing discord by, slanderizing your kingdom will have been dealt with. That brings us to the bandits. This one is actually incredibly simple. You go find their bandit hideout, which I believe is the Riverblades camp, and you go kill them all. Real easy peasy stuff. Now, they try to offer a little bit of explanation as to why these bandits are doing it, but, they're bandits. You go there, you kill all of them. One or two of them will try to explain that Irovetti gave them no choice. He tracked them down and told them they either had to attack your kingdom or he'd killed them. But it's like, they're bandits. And also, he's not personally there. There's not soldiers with them. They could have literally just came to you and been like, hey, he's paying us to try to, take out your kingdom. And then you could have, sent them on their way or something. My point is, I don't really buy this excuse. I think it's weak storytelling, to be honest. Nonetheless, bandits are attacking, you kill them, problem solved. I do want to mention that if you spared one of the Stag Lord's lieutenants who, begs for his life at the Stag Lord Fortress, he's actually with these group of bandits. So, just something worth noting, I guess. And that brings us to the monsters that are popping up everywhere. As we explore Pitax, we can find a cave where there are a bunch of monsters guarding the place. And as we make our way through, we will eventually find the gnome from actually Jubilost's side quest. I cannot pronounce these gnomes' names, and I'm not even going to try. But you will have potentially met him before. And basically, gnomes in Pathfinder are subject to what they call the bleaching, where essentially they have to keep searching out new and exciting experiences, or they literally kind of turn white and die. It's known as the bleaching. So this particular gnome has taken great fun in setting up a magical teleportation ring, in which case, he's teleporting all these monsters into your kingdom from here. So you kill all the monsters, kill him, because he will attack you regardless, and then that will take care of the monsters. While that does solve all the initial problems facing our kingdom, at this point we can head back to our capital, and before we can actually do anything else, this next part has to happen. And I'm not wild about it because it feels a little out of sequence, but nonetheless, it is the way that it is required to be played, so here we are. Potentially, you will have already gotten this quest up to this point, but I feel like this is the best place to mention it. When you return to your capital at some point during all this, you'll probably be confronted by Lindsay and a guy named the Storyteller, who's a guy who's been with you the whole game. You turn in relics to him, he tells you stories about the history of the Stolen Lands. Well, Lindsay and the Storyteller have found a way to use bardic magic to enter Nyrissa's dreams, where you can, learn more about her and what she's after, her goals and motives. So they will ask you to use kingdom resources to prepare for the ritual, which results in a kingdom event, which on auto is, pretty much immediate. And then once that is done, you can go speak to the Storyteller to begin this sequence where you enter Nyrissa's dreams and you learn a lot about her. Now, this is actually a pretty cool quest. I enjoyed this quite a bit. So it starts with a small rehash of what we learned in Chapter 3, that Nyrissa was cursed by an eldest of the First World for doing something that we're not really sure of at this point in time. However, she seems to have stolen something, as the eldest puts it, and cursed her. And we learn right here that she was required to destroy 1,000 kingdoms. And for each one, it would fill a cup, a magical cup called the Apology, with grains of dust for each kingdom destroyed. And the Lantern King demanded she do this literally 1,000 times. And at that point, she would be forgiven her trespass, which we learned very shortly after this, so I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, was apparently that she was Queen of the Nymphs at one point, and she aspired to become an eldest herself. And she challenged the eldest's power. And the eldests are just shy of gods. They're not true gods, but they're very powerful. And they don't like that power being questioned or challenged. So they sent one of their big servants to fight Nyrissa, and she lost, thus leading to the curse. Now, as again we learned in Chapter 3, something was taken from Nyrissa when this happens, and this is where we learn exactly what it is, and I can take some time to talk about the Briar. So what was taken from Nyrissa when she was cursed was literally her ability to love. The eldest gave it a physical form, and thus it became the Briar, and then he hid it somewhere in the Stolen Lands. And that's the primary thing we learn from this dream sequence. Now, coincidentally, if you have a good aligned character, it is possible to go slightly deeper in this dream and learn more from Nyrissa, which helps if you're going after the secret ending quite a bit. However, it is not required. It does make it easier, though. And we will be talking about the Briar again in a little bit more detail in just a little bit at a separate part of this video. In the last part of this dream, we get a little bit more detail about what Nyrissa's been doing, where basically she's just been manipulating people like ourselves, the Stag Lord, King Irovedi, actually, Armag from Chapter 5, into creating kingdoms, and then she destroys them to fill her apology cup. But more importantly, we learn that she's very close to finishing it. She only needs 2 more grains of dust now. And if you're keeping count, that's your kingdom and King Irovedi's kingdom. So she's planning on letting you two duke it out. And because she, likes a good laugh, she decides to go tell you in this dream sequence, when she kind of like lucid dreams and realizes that you're in her dreams, tells you that Irovedi rose to power quite suddenly through a terrible act. And she tells you where to go learn about it, the White Rose Abbey. Now, obviously, she's the one that orchestrated this and knows all about what happened because, again, King Irovedi is working for her, if we hadn't figured that out up to this point already. At this point, we can exit the dream and we can go explore White Rose Abbey. White Rose Abbey is a very tiny map in the upper corner of Pitax. So, again, very small little map area. It's literally just a straight shot. There's kind of a big fight, some traps, and you'll fight a guy named the Gardener at the end of it in front of this fancy-looking little prison cell. If we break that prison cell, we can talk to a Nereid named Evindra. Evindra was actually just in the dream that we were in. So, Evindra was one of, as she calls herself, Nyrissa's cousins. Evindra, upon being freed, explains that Nyrissa has told Irovedi that you're coming for him and have discovered his big secret, and that the big secret is in the lake right next to Evindra. Evindra will also express interest in coming to your capital to help you discover ways to free Nyrissa from her curse. You can choose to do this, you can let her go, or you can kill her. I don't recommend killing her because there's literally no reward. The experience is awful. She has 1 gold on her. Pretty much a waste of time unless you just want to do it for the sake of doing it. If you invite her to your capital, talking to Evindra at your capital is where you can learn a lot of the information about exactly what it is Nyrissa did to the eldest, which I already explained just a bit ago. So if you already have that knowledge, you can just turn her away and it doesn't really make much of a difference. However, after this conversation, we can dive into the river, or the lake rather, in this little cave behind us, and we will find out what King Irovedi's secret is. King Irovedi had a bunch of the noble families of Pitax children murdered. It would seem that he used this event to rapidly rise to power. Basically, he killed a bunch of people and took over the resulting power vacuum. Now, at this point, we have nothing else to do, really, so we head back to our capital, where we should be greeted with a kingdom event in our throne room, where the ambassador from Pitax, Stefano Monsconi, something like that, shows up in your throne room and basically tells you that King Irovedi knows all about how terribly things are going in your barony from the events that he caused, and invites you to come to Pitax to surrender your crown and submit to him under his new rule. You can respond to this and, basically say yeah, all right, I'll be there. Or you can have Stefano here murdered, which I recommend you do, because if you don't kill him here, you will have to fight him in just a little bit. You don't have a choice. He will fight you. However, if you kill him here, your guards will take him away, and it's one less powerful guy you gotta fight later. So I recommend killing him right here, because you don't even have to fight him. So then we make our way to the capital of Pitax. Now when we arrive at Pitax, you actually want to take this opportunity to go around town and talk to people, because we can use the secrets we just learned about the noble families of Pitax and talk to their leader, and convince the nobles to support our fight with King Irovetti. We can also talk to the captain of the guard and potentially even convince her to help us out. So basically, you just want to take this opportunity to talk to some of these people and try to bring them over to your side. And when you're ready, go confront King Irovetti in front of his palace, where he'll basically ask you to surrender, as I mentioned. And funnily enough, you can actually do that. You can surrender your crown. If you do that, it's just a game over. That's all that happens. Now, obviously, we're going to fight King Irovetti. Now, a small scene will play out right in front of the palace where the small factions of Pitax will declare their allegiance to either you or Irovetti, and then you'll have to win the resulting fight that can, be of varying difficulties depending on whether or not people are on your side or not. And then we can enter King Irovetti's palace. This palace is actually really cool. It's a small dungeon. It's not super large by any means. However, there's a couple different ways to tackle it. There's a little event at the front gate where some of the guards try to kill you, but you just put them down real fast. It always struck me as an odd event because, obviously they're going to try to kill you, but they decided to give it a bunch of dialogue for seemingly no reason. But from here, we can either rush straight forward, which will get us ambushed by a ton of people, or we can explore to the left and right of the entrance, which will allow us to slowly and systematically kill a bunch of people guarding the palace. We can find secret rooms that have backup enemies, just waiting around in them, that if we were to run straight up and confront Irovetti when the fight starts, all of them would come pouring out. So if you go up the sides, you can discover those rooms, as well as a lot of other cool stuff in the palace. Some stuff's not related to the fight with Irovetti, but exploring gives you an opportunity to find hidden rooms, open locked doors that allow you to confront one-on-one some of the stronger lieutenants and things Irovetti summons, thus making the actual fight with him much easier, which I highly recommend you do, especially on higher difficulties. Also, a weird random thing, I don't know, because this has actually never happened in any of my other playthroughs. Every single person in this palace right here just beelined for Tristan this time. I don't know what I did differently exactly, but the AI would just not leave Tristan alone. All of them. Even if I put Tristan on the other side of the map in here, and then engaged in enemies, they would completely ignore the people right in front of them and go running across the castle to go attack Tristan. I don't know, it was just very strange. I've never seen that before. I don't know if that was a bug or what, but it was a kind of fun little anecdote, so I figured I'd mention it to you guys. Now, eventually, you're going to come to the fight with King Irovetti himself. You'll have a short conversation where a fight will ensue. Now, before that fight ensues, you can ask him what the deal with Tartusio was all about, and he will very quickly explain that Tartusio was simply trying to help him find the Briar. And spoiler alert, he found it. The artifact that Tartusio recovered from under the old sycamore was in fact the Briar, the physical manifestation of Nirissa's ability to love. King Irovetti, while maybe not the most morally upright guy, isn't an idiot, if nothing else, and he realized that Nirissa was planning on killing him in some way, so he was trying to find leverage on her. And he was using Tartusio to do that. And Tartusio, surprisingly enough, managed to actually find the Briar, which he then transported to Irovetti in the portal scene that we saw in, I believe it was chapter 1 or part 1 of this series. But as we're killing Irovetti, chances are you'll see this scene play out where he calls in Ingledis, which is a naga, and then he'll attempt to command her using the Briar. However, at this point, Nirissa will more than likely come into this fight, chastise Irovetti for trying to keep the Briar from her, and then sick Ingledis on Irovetti, who will kill him, and then you'll be forced to deal with Ingledis, which is usually an easy fight. She actually has a heal ability that's really strong that she'll use over and over again, even on normal mode, so you kind of got to be prepared to deal with that, but otherwise, she's not that difficult. And upon finishing this fight, that will actually wrap up what we need to do for the chapter. But I want to talk about something else. In the last chapter, I spoke about how Nirissa was after something she wasn't able to find, and that she was using the Oculus of Abaddon to find it. Well, what she was trying to find, as you might have pieced together by now, is the Briar. If Nirissa is allowed to get her hands on the Oculus of Abaddon in any way, she finds the Briar. She knows that King Irovetti has it before we do, and then she will go find it and then have it replaced with a very sophisticated replica, resulting in the scene we just saw. Now, in order to free Nirissa from her curse, which is the actual secret ending I've been slowly hinting at throughout this series, you need the briar. It is required. If she gets her hands on it first, you can still find it. It's just very difficult. We'll talk about that in probably the next part, actually. If we are able to meet the requirements to have Tristan destroy the Oculus instead of stealing it from Vorticai to begin with, then Nyrissa will never learn the location of the briar, and thus the briar that we find on Iroveti's corpse will be the real briar, which again makes the secret ending a little easier, which might save you a headache or two. So, after this, we will have officially conquered Pitax. We can return to our capital, where either through kingdom management or the auto scenes, we will be able to deal with the resulting aftermath of Pitax, assign a new governor, deal with the city guard, deal with the thieves guild there, which is kind of like the bandits and stuff, and basically decide how we want to run the kingdom of Pitax. Now, after this, the only thing left to do is finish out Ancient Curse Part 6. Part 7 is actually just a freebie part of the curse. You will have the entire timer of Part 7 to explore and focus on kingdom management, which is a great time to wrap up things like achievements. Now, what I actually recommend you do is the explore part of that. Finish out exploring. Now, ideally, up to this point, you'd only have one part of the map left, which is a place called Thousand Voices, which Part 7 is a great time to explore that instead of right after Part 7, because Part 7 is the last part of the Ancient Curse. At the end of Part 7, the end of the game is kind of thrown towards you. Not the end, there's actually still quite a bit of content left, but it's less about kingdom management and more about a narrative to the end of the game. That will be the next part of this series, which is why I'm explaining it here. I hope you guys are looking forward to it. Thank you so much for watching this video. It truly does help and it means a lot to me. So again, thank you. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day. What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you our final part in our Story of Pathfinder Kingmaker series. In our last episode, we successfully defended our kingdom from an invasions of sorts from Iroveti, the king of Pitax. So after that concludes, we need to wait for whatever's left of the Ancient Curse Part 6 to carry through, and then we get a bit of a freebie part of the Ancient Curse timer that is Part 7. Now, at the end of Part 7, during which you will have been able to basically just freely explore the map and focus on your kingdom management, but at the end of Part 7, you will be directed to head to a spot on the map called Thousand Voices, specifically an area called the Castle of Knives. Now, this is where your kingdom will start to crumble pretty quickly. So, up to this point, the Ancient Curse has been establishing portals at the Bald Hilltop. And as this curse has progressed, that portal has become more stable. And now, it's finally stable enough for you to travel to the First World to confront Nyrissa. Now, in your capital, you will wind up having a small council with all of your companions where you guys basically say, okay, now we need to go confront Nyrissa and wrap this up and put a bow on it. From here, the rest of the game is more of a narrative experience as well as combat. The kingdom management stuff falls off. The timers are still kind of there here and there. However, most of the other stuff kind of falls away. Now, I do want to mention that if you are thinking, well, I'll just take my time and continue on until, I'm ready to go, I wouldn't recommend it, because if you are playing with kingdom management on, you're going to be given 3 problem events a day until eventually you're not going to have advisors to deal with them. And then they will continue because most problem events take at least 7 days to complete. So essentially, you're going to be overwhelmed with kingdom events until your kingdom falls. Or alternatively, on auto, you'll just hit a timer that ends your game. You need to head to the Castle of Knives in Thousand Voices. Now, upon arriving at the Castle of Knives, you're going to run into the Nerly Witch as well as the Wriggling Man, and they'll be arguing over something, and they start fighting. Shortly after this, an entity called Shaika the Mini will appear to you. Shaika is actually one of the eldest of the First World herself. Or his self, or itself. So Shaika the Mini is more than just a title for this person. Shaika is actually an arcanomancer, so to speak, that is to say a master of time. Now, as the title might imply, Shaika takes on many forms. They all speak with the same voice, and they all have the same powers. It can be a man, a woman, different races, all sorts of stuff, hence the name Shaika the Mini. But Shaika will explain to us that the Nerly Witch and the Wriggling Man are Nyrissa's lieutenants and chief advisors, and they are fighting over something called the First Crown that has been lost. The First Crown was the crown of the king from the very first kingdom that Nyrissa destroyed to fill her apology cup. So the outside portion of the Castle of Knives, you will be able to track down the 3 pieces of the broken first crown that you can then assemble and take back to Shika here, where you can make a decision. You can give it to an Inquisitor you will have met while doing this quest. That's kind of the neutral option. It gives the cursed king in the crown rest. Or you can keep the crown for yourself, you can give it to Shika, or you can potentially free the spirit of the king that is trapped in this crown. Now, like I mentioned, giving it to the Inquisitor is kind of the real option without too much of a hassle. If you give it to Shika, that has big implications. Keeping it for yourself has a few things here and there, but isn't that big of a deal. And then freeing the ghost has some ramifications as well. So freeing him will actually call for his help in a later battle, whereas giving it to Shika has a much bigger consequence that I will discuss at the right time. But suffice to say, it's a pretty important quest. Now, once you get this done, you can head farther up into the Castle of Knives, where eventually you will find a portal. And out will walk a guy called the Horned Hunter, who says that he helps guard the portal and that he works for Nyrissa. At which point he will summon a couple of Jabberwocks to fight you, and once they're dead, you'll be free to enter the portal to the First World. Now, when you enter, you're going to wake up alone, but you'll see a vision of Nyrissa guiding Lindsay into this house. Now, once you wake up properly and come to your, senses where you can move around, you will meet Evindra. Evindra being a character, of course, that we met in Chapter 6, and is Nyrissa's Nereid cousin. Evindra will explain that Nyrissa has taken your companions and scattered them around through her house at the end of time, which is kind of like her seat of power in the First World. Evindra will also explain that if you haven't found the Briar, that is to say that you didn't get the actual Briar from Irovedi, that the Briar is in the house somewhere. Evindra will actually just offer up this information for you. And because she offers it up, I'm going to explain real fast. If you don't have the Briar up to this point, it's still possible to get it. It's just very difficult because you have to pass a very high perception check on the 2nd floor, I believe it is. And then even if you pass that perception check, you then have to pass the very high lock-picking skill check next to then get the Briar. So it's very easy to miss, even now that we know where it is again, because you have to pass 2 very high checks to find it and then actually be able to get it. So ideally, it is actually easier to get it from Irovedi if possible. Now, like I mentioned, we came to all by ourselves, and that our companions are scattered around the house. So once we enter the house, we need to start picking up our companions. Now, this is also a very important part of the story because, as I mentioned in a previous episode, I believe, doing your side quests for your companions is important. And this moment is why. If your companion's side quest was not successfully completed, they will die here. Basically, if any of the side quests failed for any reason, they will die or leave. In the case of Amiri, they leave, because Amiri is like an iconic character for Pathfinder, so they didn't want to actually kill her off. So she will leave, but everyone else pretty well just dies. When it comes to the side quests, you don't necessarily have to resolve them any particular way. There are multiple ways for each of those side quests to resolve themselves, thus affecting the end slide that you'll see for that companion at the end of the game. However, all you have to do to keep them alive here is successfully complete the quest in some way. So once we gather up all of our companions, which involves fighting a couple people, specifically the Horned Hunter again as we pick up Lindsay. Also, if Lindsay dies, her consciousness gets transferred into the book she's writing so she can continue writing it, because she is of course our narrator, as well as the person in charge of writing the journal entries for all of our quests. And also, it's important that you fought Horned Hunter right here. Now, while we're picking up Lindsay, she will explain that there are keys that lead to the shrine where the apology is kept, because that's what we're trying to get to. Because if we can get to the apology, we can force Nyrissa to appear and confront us. Because until then, she's not the type to confront people herself, as you might have guessed from her backhanded tactics up to this point in the game. So, finding the keys to get into the shrine involves exploring the sanctum a little bit here. So, the Knurly Witch and the Wriggling Man that we met earlier will both have one of the keys. The Knurly Witch is in the basement, the Wriggling Man is up on the 2nd floor. Ironically enough, they hate each other and will both task you with trying to find the other one, or, killing the other one for them. And then the 3rd key is actually hidden in a mist puzzle in the basement as well, which is a bit of a pain, but as long as you're exploring, you'll eventually find it. And all you have to do is solve that puzzle, kill an enemy, and grab the key from them. Now, when it comes to the Gnurly Witch, it is possible, if you have the evil alignment, to convince her to just not fight you at all and just give you the key, which is pretty nice, actually. Now, if you choose to fight her, and you set the king from the first crown free from the crown, he will actually assist you in that fight with the Gnurly Witch. Now, as for the Wriggly Man, he has some stuff going on, but, you can also just kill him for the key. He's involved with, like, a side quest and some mirrors and stuff. So, again, it's a thing you can do, but honestly, you just need the key from him. Now, once you have all 3 of these keys, you can enter the shrine where the Apology Cup is being kept, and thus Nyrissa will finally confront you. Now, this is a very important scene. It's potentially the end of the game, even. When Nyrissa pops up to confront us, we will actually see the Horn Hunter chained to a tree where he was punished for failing Nyrissa by not being able to kill you. But as we're talking to Nyrissa, a few things come up here. 1, if you have the briar, you can attempt to return it to her, which opens up the option to not have to fight her. But while it is part of the secret ending, it's not the whole thing. In order to unlock the secret ending, which kind of begins to see its fruition right here, you have to have been trying to romance Nyrissa the entire time, which of course involves not completing a romance with any other characters, as well as researching 13 of the 16 available curses through kingdom management, so you can have an understanding of curses, as well as getting some specific dialogue options from Tartuk, as well as Vortikai. It involves, of course, finding the briar and giving it to her. So basically what needs to happen is, when you give the briar to her, she has to, A, want to accept it, which requires her to be in love with you, right? So if she doesn't want to accept the briar, then the fight just happens like normal. But if you've romanced her enough through conversation options with her up to this point, she can accept the briar from you, which is great. You get to skip the fight. However, you might not know how to then free her from her curse from the Lantern King, which is where all the research on the curses comes in. And then, even then, with all that research, you still have to have the conversation options from the 2 individuals I mentioned earlier to actually then trigger the final parts. So again, there's a lot going on, but that is what involves the secret ending. It kind of sees its comeuppance right here. We will finish that once we get to the appropriate part. Now, once we fight Nyrissa, if that's what happened, or, we skipped that fight, the Horned Hunter will reveal himself as none other than the Lantern King himself, as he easily shakes off Nyrissa's spells holding him to the tree. As punishment, he then transforms into Remus, the guy we met when we first left Oleg's trading post, as well as again through a couple quests throughout the game that I had called attention to. He also reveals himself to be the gnome that we met in the Bloom in Chapter 3, and then he explains, if you chose to spare Nyrissa's life here, that he doesn't appreciate his toy being taken away from him, because you and Nyrissa will have teamed up to form an alliance after she was defeated, because her kingdom falling with her defeat will have been the 1,000th grain in the Apology Cup. But again, you'll be able to form an alliance or spare her life just in general. And the Lantern King won't like that, basically. And he will then depart to go attack your kingdom as a bit of a revenge type thing for sparing Nyrissa's life. Now, if Nyrissa dies right here, that's it. Game over. That's just the end of the game. It's not necessarily a bad ending, but it's not the actual ending. And because, ironically enough, people don't like Nyrissa, despite her supposed to being like a tortured villain type thing, this is also kind of an acceptable ending to the game. But there is potentially one more chapter, which we're about to get into. But before we do that, one last thing. If we gave the first crown to Shaika the Mini, and we either did not give Nyrissa the briar or she did not accept it, then what Shaika will do is use the first crown and her powers over time to essentially take a grain of dust from the Apology Cup, thus resulting in Nyrissa's death without you actually having to fight her. Again, giving you the ending of the game right here. Let's assume you either went with the secret ending that required you to not fight Nyrissa, or you fought her and then chose to spare her life and made an alliance, and now the Lantern King has departed in anger, trying to destroy your kingdom. You will have to follow him through a portal when you are ready and you've explored all of the stuff in the house that you wanted to explore and you're ready to move on. When you go through that portal, you will find yourself in your capital again. You will meet with the Lantern King, where he will explain that the very first time he met you outside of Oleg trading post, he said some very specific things to you about he who inherits the stolen lands inherits its pain and its death. Turns out that was actually a curse, and the Lantern King formally curses you right here. you will have to escape this little area of the map, which involves just fighting through some weaker monsters, and you'll probably quickly notice that this curse is debilitating. It is a status effect that gives you minus 60% damage, like a 30 or 40% chance to re-roll your crit rolls. It's a pretty brutal curse. But you'll have to escape, and you'll meet the storyteller just towards the entrance. The storyteller will then kind of lead you to a bit of a clearing where you can gather your forces, and he'll explain that, you're cursed. And basically what you need to do is go around your kingdom, gather up your allies and things, and through gathering them, that should weaken the Lantern King's curse on you. Now, lucky for us, the traveling is instant. It's not like the world map we were using earlier. It's just a text event where you click where you want to go, and you're there. Now, you can't rest here outside of talking to the storyteller, who will then help you rest, which is important because that passes time. You have about 20 days or so to wrap all of this up, or the game ends and you fail. Now, as I mentioned, in order to clear this curse from us, which will then carry the story forward, we need to deal with all of the problems the Lantern King is causing around our kingdom. And what he's doing is he's summoning shadows of your past enemies as he drags your kingdom into the first world. So what we need to do is use this portal to travel to the various spots of importance through the map that the storyteller will have told us about and resolve the situation there, which usually involves fighting a shadow of an enemy we've already fought. For instance, we need to go to Oleg's trading post to help our city guard out, and it turns out the Stag Lord, or at least the shadow of the Stag Lord, is attacking Oleg's post again. You can kill him, thus helping Oleg's post as well as freeing up your city guard, which then removes a portion of the curse. So you need to do that until the curse is gone. Now, also a couple of other things about this particular part of the game. If you are working on the secret ending, there will also be a little extra with Nerissa where she needs to gather the approval, so to speak, of the other eldest. So there will be a little extra bit with that I wanted to mention, as well as you seeing the culmination of some of your choices here and there. For instance, if you chose to let Tartuk go in Chapter 2, Troll Trouble, this is where you can meet him when you go to Trobold. He can potentially even join your party as a sorcerer. So just stuff like that, you'll start to see the culmination. Now eventually, once this curse is broken, you can then tell the storyteller that you're ready to finally march on the capital with your acquired forces. Now again, what that actually looks like is going to be very different depending on your choices throughout the game. You could have Jamandi on your side. You could maybe not be on your side if you didn't side with her. Maybe Armag's there helping you out. Maybe it's another leader that you put in charge of the Tiger Lords. Kind of just a lot of variations there. Basically, who's your ally and who's not. This can play out a lot of different ways. Now, once we tell the storyteller we're ready to go, if Khalik and Kanara, the DLC companion, are still alive, you'll get a short scene with the forefather where he finally, takes his plan into motion. The forefather is, of course, Khalik and Kanara's dad, actually. At which point you'll be given the opportunity to go finish their companion quest. Well, the rest of their companion quest, I should say, which is the only one that actually plays out after the House of the End of Time. Barring that, you can then travel to confront the Lantern King, which involves you traveling around the fantastical ruins of your capital city as they kind of transcended into the first world. This is where you'll start seeing all of the assembled forces you just gathered, helping you fight through the city. You'll eventually find a piece of the Apology Cup that was destroyed. The storyteller tells you that you need to find all of the fragments of the Apology Cup, bring them to him, so he can destroy them, which will then destroy the barrier to your throne room, which is where the Lantern King is actually waiting for you. So once you do exactly that, gather up all of the fragments of the broken Apology Cup, which is broken because you spared Nerissa's life, you'll then be able to have the storyteller destroy them and move on to the final confrontation with the Lantern King. So this is a pretty interesting fight. I like that it tells you about the forms of the Lantern King, by the way. So Remus is like the curses and prophecies part of the Lantern King. The gnome is like the jokes and laughter part of the Lantern King. And then the Horned Hunter is like the chaos and craziness of the Lantern King. Because the Lantern King is like the embodiment of like laughter, deceit, and chaos. So I just thought it was cool that they gave like a purpose to each of the forms that they gave him throughout the game. But regardless, you'll have to fight each of those forms, and then after that, the Lantern King will show his true form, which is of course the giant globe of fire we'll have seen up to this point. He will try to properly activate the curse that he laid on you. This is done through like a text event. I've personally never failed this, so I don't know that it is actually possible to do so. But what does happen is that it can affect the companions that are then helping you with the final part of this fight. So for each like successful speech option you pass, kind of countering his curse, some of your companions will like either die or be taken back. But then there's an alignment choice at the end of it in which it kind of seems like you can just forcefully take all of them with you. So I'm not entirely sure that this conversation has any ramifications because I haven't actually seen any, but it seems to imply that like maybe you'd lose some of your companions for the final part of the fight. But again, I haven't actually seen all that. But because the alignment choice, you can only, have like potentially 2 alignments to choose from, and I haven't used every single one of them in this particular conversation. I don't believe there is any particular consequence to this conversation. At least it doesn't, in my experience, seem to have been any. And I've beaten this guy like 4, 5, 6 times now. After this text event in which, you use your words and things to properly counter his curse, you then fight the Lantern King's final form, which will then kill him properly. At which point, he's almost immediately reborn because Fae in the First World are immortal, which is a thing. But he'll have lost a bunch of power because he died. All of his followers are dead, and he doesn't like to die because he mentions, if you haven't done the secret ending, the other eldest can use that opportunity of him dying to play very intricate pranks, which is an allusion to the secret ending if you haven't gotten it. This is potentially also where the secret ending plays out, which is the only way to actually kill the Lantern King. So if you've successfully romanced Nyrissa, freed her of her curse, got the support of the eldest and everything like I mentioned earlier in this video, you will then have an extra conversation option right here where you will actually potentially be able to actually kill the Lantern King, like completely. If you just got here and don't have the true secret ending going on, once you get to this point you'll have a few different options. Because the Lantern King will offer you immortality and power, and you guys just call it a day. Nyrissa will offer you the same thing, basically, because she's capable of doing that. They're both essentially going to connect you to the First World, thus granting you the immortality that they have, and then they'll kind of become an intricate part of your kingdom. So if you side with the Lantern King in that way, he's literally called the Laughing Lie. His whole thing is like jokes and deceit. So as you might imagine, that ending is not great for your kingdom, but you can choose it because it's the end of the game, so whatever. Nyrissa is kind of the same thing, but if you choose this, you both remain cursed, but it's like the curse has lost all of its power in a way because the Lantern King was defeated, but you are both still cursed, which in my opinion is kind of the neutral option if you want it. Or the other option where you basically tell the Lantern King to remove the curse completely, and all of you just go your separate ways, and they give you your kingdom, which, in my opinion, is the best option outside of the secret ending. And then after that happens, you will be greeted with all the lovely ending slides of all your choices throughout the game. Now, regardless of how things went for you, I find the ending slides to be very satisfying. It's definitely like a payoff of all of the choices you've made in this very long and very extensive RPG. So, there you go, guys. There is the story of Pathfinder Kingmaker. I tried to pack all of the endings and everything in there. Obviously, the ending slides have so much variation, it would take me absolutely forever to go over every possible option. But I will kind of have the end slides up, and you'll kind of see kind of what it goes over, and then there's a lot of variation for each of those. I certainly hope you guys enjoyed the story series here and the plot of Pathfinder Kingmaker. I really enjoyed the game. The story was really cool, even if the game itself had its flaws, which you can check out my review after 100% if you are so interested in hearing my thoughts on those. But regardless, thank you guys so much for watching. I certainly hope you guys like, comment, subscribe, stick around, see what the channel's doing in the future. But again, thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.
Moved its troops to the southern border of the kingdom. Their attack was rebuffed. The enemy state's infantry retreated when the army's wizards brought down rains of fire and magical arrows on the heads of the flabbergasted enemy soldiers. Since then, Galt hasn't risked crossing any borders again, fearing cruel retaliation for further insolence. The feud between Brevois North and South, which had been smoldering for ages, finally sparked the fires of civil war. We didn't interfere, watching as the forces of House Surtova and the Sword Lords slaughtered each other. Alternating between brief truces and fresh fights, Brevois was flooded with blood and grew weak. Its leaders could only watch helplessly as their border territories were slowly annexed by neighbors, until they fell to squabbling among themselves. The butchery in Brevois jeopardized the peace of the entire region. The Tiger Lords found it difficult to recuperate after what Armagh did to them. The barbarians remaining in Numeria weren't very happy that we sheltered the deposed chief and his supporters, but they were too afraid of him to attack us over it. That bomb has a long fuse, but it's definitely burning. I'm afraid that a few generations down the road, the grandchildren of the current Tiger Lords may want to retaliate against us for their grandfathers. Pitax almost returned to its former state, a joyful city filled with beers of dubious quality and deals of questionable legality. The old trade houses lost the crown, but they retrieved the property Iravetti had taken from them. Soon, Pitax became almost like a second capital in the kingdom, a thriving city through which rivers of money from across the region ran. Unfortunately, we get much less of this money than we would like. Governor Lyachenza turned out to be helpless against widespread embezzlement. Maestro Bellavara gave the Academy of the Arts a second wind, throwing out mediocre students and sycophants. She gathered within its walls talented visionaries, rebels, and freethinkers, those whose gifts felt cramped within the walls of more respectable institutions. She managed to do what Iravetti never could, namely, make the Academy truly famous, albeit scandalously so. Trolls and kobolds, two of the most savage native peoples living in the Gnarl Marches, were completely exterminated. After enduring so many storms and troubles, Varnhold eventually turned into a real city. Daring settlers decided to conquer the vast, wild expanses of Dunsword, and despite all odds, they succeeded. The modest Magar Varn didn't stay at the court for long. Having saved some seed money, he left service and organized a new Varnling host. The Sootscale kobolds think themselves the masters of the area around the Old Sycamore, and they aren't very friendly toward travelers. It hasn't come to bloodshed yet, but many careless travelers have broken an arm or a leg in the kobolds' traps. Due to tumult on both sides of the border, Oleg's trading post gradually fell into desolation, regretfully leaving its walls, for which so much blood had been shed. Oleg and Svetlana left the backcountry that was so dear to their hearts and returned to the noise of the big city. Jod and Keston, after surviving the bloom, remained loyal to the king they followed through thick and thin, and they continue to serve as court advisors to this day. The austere priest and the gloomy warrior regularly argue over the proper way to govern the state, as well as which of the two rulers. Keston Garas took a post as chief of the kingdom's guard. The former heir to a noble family never returned to Brevois, severing all ties to his kin. However, Jod remained loyal to the king to the end of his days, healing the sick and generously sharing his austere wisdom with anyone who wished to. Having participated in Lamashtu's ritual, Olika gave birth to a strong and healthy baby. Sadly, the child grew into an unruly and violent adolescent. Having maimed a peer at just 10 years of age, the boy escaped to the Gnarl Marches, fleeing the rage of a mob that tore his mother. The lizard folk of the Longtail tribe returned to live on the shores of Candlemere, but they couldn't return to their ancient way of life. Living alongside people, the lizard folk adopted their behaviors, habits, and even religion. Evindra was glad to see the Lantern King's plans turn to dust. She spent some time helping restore the kingdom after the calamity, then returned home to the First World. They say the rebellious spirit of her cousin. After the victory, the storyteller abandoned his affairs and began spending a lot of time alone in contemplation. We never saw Amiri again. Perhaps she got lost somewhere in the First World. Or maybe she found some other way back. Who knows? Valerie stayed to serve the king, and to this day she continues to be a muse to many people. Not just bards and admirers, but to warriors as well. Harren became famous, respected by dwarves throughout our kingdom as well as our neighbors, even as far as the Five Kings Mountains. He's often been asked to help out or teach others, and he's never denied anyone this. Jaethal spent some time at the king's court, but it became progressively harder for her to hide her true nature from the omnipresent servants of Pharasma. Realizing the risk, she reluctantly left the kingdom, and she soon sent a message from Geb, in a country populated Octavia didn't stay still for very long. Soon, she and Reg went to Numeria and started a huge slave rebellion there. They didn't manage to destroy the Technic League, but to this day, slaves speak their names with admiration, and slavers with Rigangar left for Numeria with Octavia to start a slave rebellion. Over the journey, he really matured. Ekin spent a few years in the Stolen Lands, and in that time won glory as the most rugged monster hunter in all the River Kingdoms. The Ranger exterminated even the most harmless of the monsters around the capital, then moved on to other lands and new victories. They say the ruthless avenger and slayer of wild monsters made it as far. Jubilost returned to the life of a traveling explorer, frequently visiting his favorite kingdom. He said so himself. His famous work studying the First World all opened with a dedication to his longtime companion, the King. Another name was also... As for Knock Knock, Jester Knock Knock, he continued to be a great source of entertainment for the kingdom, both in and out of the throne room, sometimes even on purpose. His antics in the kingdom had an additional effect. Aside from bringing joy and amusement to the citizens, it also softened the common view of goblins. They even became welcome in the streets of the city, for a time. While he may not have become the hero he envisioned, Knock Knock did find himself and his inner strengths thanks to the king. If you should ever find yourself in the kingdom, be sure to seek him out. Despite all the woes that befell the country, our king remains a strong leader. Many noble houses from neighboring lands wouldn't hesitate. As for myself, the author of this book, Lindsay who never chose a pretty nickname, I stayed here, within my own book, to watch what happens in the kingdom, and one day...